Hi guys, tonight we step quietly beyond the last warm lights of the modern world and into a darkness so old that even memory cannot reach it. You stand beneath a wide prehistoric sky, where the stars seem sharper, the air smells of damp earth and cold stone, and a small fire crackles inside the mouth of a limestone shelter. Somewhere beyond the glow, an animal calls once, and then falls silent. The night feels enormous, but not empty. People have lived here. They have slept beside these walls, sharpened tools near the fire, carried children through winter rain, and watched the same moon rise over the valley. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the local time is where you live. Now, dim the lights and follow the faint orange glow deeper into the shelter. Before you can understand the missing chapter of human history, you first have to notice how little remains. The past is not a complete book waiting patiently on a shelf. It is more like a handful of damp pages found after a storm. A bone survives here. A hearth survives there. A row of footprints hardens in ancient mud, only to be buried beneath sand for tens of thousands of years. Most voices disappear completely. Most shelters collapse, most wooden tools rot away. You walk slowly across the cave floor. Under your feet, layers of dust and ash have gathered one above another. To an archaeologist, these thin bands are almost like the rings of a tree. Yet even when the evidence is carefully uncovered, it rarely tells a simple story. The broad historical background begins far earlier than cities, farms, roads, or written names for most of human existence. People lived in small mobile communities. They moved with seasons, water, animals, and ripening plants. Their world was shaped by climate, geography, and memory rather than borders on a map. Travel happened on foot. Knowledge passed from person to person. A good water source, a safe crossing, or a hidden patch of edible roots could matter more than any treasure. A mainstream fact is that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared in Africa at least 300,000 years ago. That figure sounds neat when placed in a sentence, but the reality behind it is much less tidy. Early members of our species did not all look exactly alike, behave exactly alike, or live in one single region. You pause beside a shallow depression where a fire once burned. The stones around it are darkened by heat. Perhaps someone sat here repairing a spear point while another person scraped fat from a hide. The smoke would have clung to hair and skin. Sparks may have lifted toward the ceiling, and here is one of the quieter surprises of prehistory. Fire was not only used for warmth and cooking in some places. Ancient people may also have used controlled burning to shape landscapes, encourage new plant growth, or attract grazing animals. It is a lesser-known possibility, difficult to prove in every case, but it reminds you that early humans were not simply wandering through untouched nature. They were observing it, responding to it, and perhaps changing it in deliberate ways. Outside the cave, the valley stretches beneath pale moonlight. There are no roads, but there are roots. Animals make trails. Rivers guide movement. Mountain passes open and close with snow. Groups may return to the same shelter after many seasons. remembering where dry wood can be found and where rainwater gathers in stone hollows. Today, you might open a map on a phone and complain because the blue dot is slightly confused. Here, direction lives in the shape of hills, the position of stars, the sound of water, and the stories of older people. Forgetting a route is not inconvenient, it can be dangerous. Still, the greatest difficulty for modern researchers is not simply finding ancient objects, it is deciding what those objects mean. A stone point may suggest hunting, but was it thrown, thrust, carried for protection, or made as a teaching piece? A cluster of shells may have been food, decoration, trade goods, or all three. Red pigment might have coloured a body, a hide, a wall, or a ritual object that has long since vanished. Researchers continue to question how early symbolic behaviour developed, and whether it appeared gradually across many populations or emerged in repeated bursts under particular social conditions. Some evidence suggests long, slow experimentation. Other discoveries look surprisingly sudden. It is simply what happens when the past speaks in fragments. You move farther toward the cave entrance, where the air becomes colder. A thin wind brushes your face. Somewhere nearby, grass bends in the dark. You imagine the people who once stood here scanning the valley at dawn. They would have known the habits of animals in exquisite detail. They could read broken stems, disturbed soil, feathers, dung, and tracks. Their survival depended on attention. Yet attention does not guarantee preservation. A life can be rich, skilled, and meaningful while leaving almost nothing behind. A wooden spear disappears, a song disappears faster, a joke shared beside the fire leaves no fossil. Human life has always contained more than tools. This is why the missing chapter is not one single event. It is a vast region of uncertainty between scattered discoveries. You know that people migrated, adapted, exchanged ideas, and met other human groups. You know they endured cold periods, warm periods, droughts, floods, and changing coastlines. But between those broad facts lie countless generations whose choices are almost invisible. Perhaps a group once invented a new knot that made carrying easier. Perhaps another learned to preserve food through smoke in a way that spread across several valleys. Perhaps a community developed signs, songs, or seasonal gatherings that lasted for centuries and then disappeared, without durable remains. Entire traditions can pass beyond recovery. The fire behind you settles with a soft crack. One ember collapses into ash. The sound is small, but in the silence it feels clear and close. You begin to understand that prehistory is not empty darkness before civilization. It is crowded darkness. It holds families, experiments, migrations, mistakes, discoveries, and ordinary evenings. The mystery exists not because nothing happened, but because almost everything happened without writing, and most of the physical world they made was fragile. As you stand at the edge of the shelter, the horizon begins to pale, shapes emerge slowly from the night. A river glimmers in the distance. Low trees gather beside it. The land seems still. Yet somewhere beyond those hills, other human communities are moving through the same dawn, and soon, you will follow them into a world where our species was not alone. You leave the limestone shelter as morning gathers gently across the valley. The fire behind you has faded to a faint orange glow, and the cold air carries the smell of wet grass, ash, and distant water ahead. The land opens beneath the pale sky. Low hills rise in the distance, and beyond them stretch forests, rocky plains, and river corridors followed by many kinds of human beings. This is the part of the story that modern imagination often simplifies. It is tempting to picture human evolution as a neat staircase, with one species replacing another in an orderly line. One figure stands upright, another becomes taller, and eventually someone invents coffee and begins complaining about emails. But the prehistoric world was much less organized. For long periods, several human species lived at the same time. You walk down toward the river, where mist hangs above the water. On one bank, you imagine a small group of Homo sapiens gathering edible plants and checking fish traps. Far away, perhaps across mountains or open grassland, Neanderthals are preparing stone tools beside another fire in parts of Asia. Denisovans or other poorly understood human groups may be moving through forests, valleys, and high plateaus. A mainstream historical fact is that Homo sapiens shared the Earth with other human species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. These groups were not crude shadows waiting to disappear. They were adapted populations with their own histories, technologies, and ways of surviving. The wider world of this period was shaped by the Pleistocene, an age of repeated climatic shifts. Glaciers expanded and retreated, rainfall patterns moved, deserts grew, then softened, forests became grasslands, and grasslands sometimes returned to woodland. A route that was open for generations could later become blocked by ice, drought, or rising water. Human communities responded by moving, adapting, dividing, and meeting again. You crouch beside the river and trail your fingers through the cold current. The water carries silt from distant hills, just as prehistoric populations carried genes, tools, customs, and memories across landscapes. Movement rarely happened in one dramatic journey. More often, it unfolded through small decisions. A family followed animals farther than before. A group remained near a spring during a dry season. Children grew up and formed new camps beyond the familiar ridge. Over centuries, those quiet choices could carry people across continents. Neanderthals lived across much of Europe and Western Asia. They were powerfully built, well suited to cold and variable environments, and skilled at making stone tools. They hunted large animals, used fire, cared for injured group members, and occupied caves as well as open-air sites. Their lives were not easy, but neither were they mindless or primitive. As you cross the river over a line of smooth stones, you notice how deliberate each step must be. Prehistoric survival required the same careful judgment. A crossing chosen badly could ruin tools, soak clothing, or separate a group. A shelter selected wisely could protect several generations during seasonal returns. One lesser-known detail is that Neanderthals sometimes collected unusual natural objects, including shells, mineral pigments, and possibly feathers or bird claws. These finds have encouraged researchers to consider whether such objects had decorative, symbolic, or social meaning. Perhaps a shell carried from a distant shore marked a journey. Perhaps a feather signaled identity. Or perhaps someone simply liked how it looked, which is a very human reason and rarely receives enough academic respect. The trail leads you into a sparse woodland. Sunlight falls through branches in narrow bands. You hear insects, the soft movement of leaves, and the occasional call of a bird somewhere nearby. Another human group may be listening to the same sounds. The Denisovans are even more mysterious. They are known largely through genetic evidence and a small number of fossil remains, many connected to Denisova Cave in Siberia. from such limited material. Researchers have learned that Denisovans were a distinct human population related to Neanderthals, and that they interbred with the ancestors of some modern human populations. It is remarkable to think that a tiny fragment of bone can reveal an entire branch of humanity. You imagine holding such a fragment in your palm. It would look ordinary, perhaps no more impressive than a small piece of weathered ivory, yet inside it, molecular traces can preserve information about ancestry, relationships, and ancient encounters. Prehistory sometimes hides its largest stories inside its smallest objects. Scholars remain divided on how many distinct human populations existed during this period, and where the boundaries between them should be drawn. Fossils are incomplete. Genetic evidence reveals groups that archaeology has not clearly identified. Some populations may have been isolated for thousands of years, while others met often enough to exchange genes and knowledge. The word species itself becomes less comfortable here. It sounds clear in a textbook. But the ancient world does not always respect tidy categories. You continue through the trees until the land rises again from the slope. You can see several ecological zones at once. River reeds shimmer below. Darker forest gathers to the north. Open grassland stretches toward the south. Each environment offers different foods, risks, and possibilities. Different human groups may have adapted to these landscapes in distinct ways. One community learned the timing of reindeer migration. Another understood mountain plants and high-altitude weather. Others followed coastlines, gathered shellfish, or moved along river systems rich in fish and birds. Knowledge was local, practical, and deeply social. A child did not learn survival from a written manual. The child watched hands. The child listened to warnings. The child followed older relatives and slowly learned which stone fractured cleanly, which cloud meant rain, and which animal track was fresh. Modern life often separates knowledge into subjects. Botany belongs in one room, geology in another, and hunting skills perhaps in a documentary watched while eating snacks in prehistory. These forms of knowledge were woven together. Stone, weather, animal behavior, memory, and cooperation all belong to the same daily world. At the top of the rise, you notice smoke in the distance. It is faint, almost lost against the sky. Someone else has made a fire. You do not know whether the people below are familiar, related, dangerous, curious, or simply passing through. They may speak a language you partly understand, or one completely unknown to you. They may carry tools shaped differently from your own. Their clothing may be cut from another kind of hide. Their gestures may seem strange. And yet, they are human. This is the quiet complexity of the age. The Earth contains several kinds of people, each carrying long histories of adaptation. They do not move through separate museum displays. Their territories overlap. Their paths cross. They see one another across rivers, beside game trails, and near stone sources used by many generations. Some encounters may be cautious, others may be peaceful. Knowledge may pass between groups without leaving an obvious mark. A method of attaching a stone point to a shaft could spread. A new way of preparing hides might be observed and copied. A song, gesture, or story could cross a boundary that archaeologists will never see. Not every meeting ends in friendship. Of course, resources can become scarce. Climate can tighten the space available to everyone. But the older image of constant hostility is too simple. Cooperation, curiosity, exchange, and intermarriage also belong to this world. The smoke on the horizon rises slowly, then thins into the brightening air. You stand still and watch it. For the first time, the missing chapter feels less like a gap and more like a crowded crossroads. Different human populations are moving through the same changing world, each carrying knowledge shaped by thousands of years. Their stories are separate, but not entirely. And as you begin walking toward that distant fire, you move closer to the moment when those stories meet. You continue toward the distant smoke, following a narrow trail between scattered trees. The morning has grown brighter, but the air still carries a sharp chill. Frost clings to shaded stones, while sunlight warms the open ground only a few steps away. It is a small contrast, almost ordinary. Yet it hints at the larger forces shaping every life in this ancient world. Climate is never simply a background here. It decides where water gathers, where animals travel, which plants grow, and how long a shelter remains useful. It can open a pathway across a continent, then close it again beneath ice, sand, or rising water. As you walk, the woodland begins to thin, the soil becomes drier beneath your feet. Pale grasses replace the damp ferns near the river, and the smell of wet earth gives way to dust and sun-warmed stone. You have crossed only a modest distance, but the landscape already feels different. During the Pleistocene, Earth passed through repeated glacial and interglacial periods. Temperatures shifted over thousands of years, sometimes creating colder and drier conditions, sometimes allowing forests and wetlands to expand or gain. These changes were not equal everywhere. One region might become greener while another grew harsh and dry. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient climate change repeatedly altered the routes available to human populations. Deserts sometimes expanded into formidable barriers. At other times, increased rainfall created lakes, grasslands, and river systems that allowed people and animals to move through areas that had once been difficult to cross. You imagine standing here across several generations. At first, perhaps the valley holds a broad river lined with trees. Herds drink near the bank, and people gather reeds, fish, and edible roots. Decades pass. Rain becomes less reliable. The river narrows. The trees retreat. Children grow up hearing stories of waterholes that no longer exist. No single morning announces the change. That is what makes climate so powerful. It can transform a human world slowly enough to feel normal, until the old normal has disappeared. You notice a shallow hollow in the ground where rainwater once collected. The mud has hardened into cracked plates. A few animal tracks cross its surface. One set is fresh, perhaps made during the night. The others are older, softened by wind. For a small community, reading such signs could mean the difference between continuing safely and wasting precious strength. People watched cloud patterns, flowering seasons, animal movement, river levels, and the arrival of birds. Their knowledge was built from repeated observation and shared memory. A quirky detail from ancient climate research is that scientists sometimes study tiny grains of pollen preserved in lake sediments to reconstruct vanished landscapes. A layer rich in tree pollen may suggest woodland. Another dominated by grass pollen may point to a more open environment. The history of an entire valley can survive in particles so small that you could brush them from your sleeve without noticing. You climb a low ridge, and the wind becomes stronger. It carries the dry scent of grass and the distant musk of animals. Below, a herd moves slowly across the plain. Their dark bodies seem almost motionless from this height. but the group is steadily travelling toward water. Humans followed similar patterns. They moved when food became scarce, when cold deepened, or when familiar resources shifted. Yet migration was rarely a simple march from one point to another. Groups paused, returned, divided, and sometimes remained isolated for long periods. Today, you might think of migration as a lane drawn across a map. In reality, ancient movement was more like smoke drifting through changing air. It spread, curled back, separated, and joined again. Researchers continue to question exactly how strongly climate controlled human expansion. Some argue that favourable environmental windows opened major migration routes. Others emphasise flexibility, technology, social networks, and human decision-making. Climate created opportunities and pressure, but people did not respond like leaves blown helplessly by wind. You descend from the ridge into a shallow basin. The ground here is softer, and clusters of low plants grow around a spring. Several stone flakes lie near the water, evidence that someone once sat here shaping tools. You can almost hear the measured tapping of stone against stone. Perhaps this spring became a meeting place during dry seasons. Animals would have gathered first. Human groups may have followed. Strangers could see one another from across the basin, each side wondering whether there was enough water to share. Climate change could bring populations together as easily as it pushed them apart. When habitable zones narrowed, different groups may have entered the same valleys, caves, and river corridors. Encounters became more likely, so did competition, exchange, and interbreeding. The changing environment did not merely move people across geography, it altered the social map of humanity. You kneel beside the spring, the water is cold and clear, emerging silently from beneath a shelf of rock. Moss grows along its edge, insects hover above the surface, and a small bird lands nearby before darting away. For now, this place feels generous. Yet even reliable springs can fail. Elsewhere, colder conditions may cover northern landscapes with ice or treeless steppe. Powerful winds sweep across open ground. Snow remains late into spring. Large grazing animals thrive in some of these environments, and skilled hunters learn to follow them. But fuel becomes scarce. Shelter matters more, and every piece of clothing must be carefully prepared. In warmer regions, drought may be the greater threat. Heat dries shallow pools, vegetation thins, groups travel farther between dependable water sources. The challenge is not simply endurance, it is remembering where survival remains possible. Ancient people carried climate knowledge through stories and habits. A warning about a dangerous crossing might be repeated for generations. A seasonal journey could become tradition long after its original reason was forgotten. Memory served as a map, weather record, and survival guide. You leave the spring and continue across the basin overhead. Clouds begin to gather, the light softens. A cool scent enters the air, and the grasses bend beneath a changing wind. Rain arrives gently at first. Drops darken the dust around your feet. Leaves tremble. The dry ground releases a rich smell, warm and earthy. Within moments, the plain seems to breathe again. You shelter beneath an overhanging rock and listen to the soft drumming of water. A storm like this may refill hollows, awaken dormant seeds, and draw animals back toward the valley. Yet too much rain could flood a camp, ruin stored food, or make travel difficult. Nothing is simply good or bad. The same water that sustains life can erase footprints, collapse shelters, and wash archaeological evidence downstream. The rain strengthens, turning the distant landscape hazy. You think of how many ancient camps have vanished beneath sediment. Rivers, dunes, and ice. Climate shaped human life, then often hid the traces afterward. When the storm begins to ease, mist rises from the ground, the herd below has moved farther south, the stone flakes near the spring shine darkly with water. Somewhere beyond the basin, the smoke you followed has disappeared from view, but its people have not vanished. They are moving through the same changing weather, making decisions shaped by cold, drought, memory, and hope. Perhaps they are seeking shelter. Perhaps they are following animals into the next valley. Perhaps they are waiting beside another fire, watching the clouds clear. You step out from beneath the rock as the last drops fall from its edge. Ahead, the landscape opens once more, transformed by rain, and the ancient paths begin leading outward toward places no one in your group has ever seen. You follow the wet trail beyond the basin, where the rain has left every stone shining beneath the pale afternoon light. Water gathers in shallow footprints, and the scent of damp grass rises around you. Behind, the spring disappears among low ridges. Ahead, the land stretches toward a distant horizon that no one in your group has crossed before. This is where the story of human movement begins to widen. For much of the 20th century, the journey of Homo sapiens out of Africa was often described as a single great departure. People imagined one successful wave moving northeast, entering Asia, and eventually spreading across the rest of the world. It was a clear story, easy to draw with one confident arrow on a map. The evidence now suggests something more complicated. A mainstream historical fact is that modern humans originated in Africa and later expanded into other continents. Yet these expansions probably happened in several phases. Some groups left Africa earlier and may have disappeared, retreated, or contributed only small traces to later populations. Other movements occurred much later and became more influential in the ancestry of people living today. You descend into a broad river valley. Reeds grow along the banks, and birds lift suddenly from the shallows as you approach. The river flows toward the east, forming a natural corridor through the landscape. For ancient travellers, waterways like this could provide drinking water, fish, plant foods, and a route that was easier to follow than open desert. Still, every journey required careful timing when rainfall increased. Parts of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula could become greener than they are today. Grasslands spread across regions now covered by desert. Lakes formed in low basins. Animals moved through these temporary corridors, and human communities followed. During drier periods, the same route could become nearly impossible. You walk beside the river, listening to water slide between stones. A child in the group collects a smooth shell from the mud. An older traveller watches the sky. Another person examines tracks at the water's edge, checking whether larger animals have passed recently. No one says, "We are leaving Africa to populate the world." They are searching for food, water, safer ground, or familiar animals. The Great Migration exists only when thousands of small movements are viewed from far in the future. That is one of the strange habits of history. From a distance, journeys look purposeful. Up close, they are often made from uncertainty. A lesser-known detail is that fossil evidence suggests Homo sapiens reached regions beyond Africa earlier than once believed. Remains found in the eastern Mediterranean and parts of Asia may represent early excursions that happened long before the major expansion associated with most living non-African populations. These travellers may have lived in new lands for generations before their lineages faded or were absorbed by other groups. You pause beneath a group of acacia-like trees where the ground is dry enough to rest. Animal hides are spread across the soil. Stone tools are checked. Someone unwraps a bundle of gathered roots and shares them quietly. Travel is slow. Supplies are limited. The group carries no wheeled carts and no written directions. Everything must fit into hands, baskets, hide bags, or simple carrying frames. Today, moving to another country may involve passports, luggage, and the minor crisis of finding a charger at the airport. Here, moving into unfamiliar land means learning an entirely new pattern of seasons, animals, plants, diseases, and dangers. You continue after the sun lowers. The river bends between rocky hills, and the path narrows. Wind passes through dry shrubs with a faint whispering sound. In the distance, a line of birds follows the water toward evening roosts. Some migration routes may have passed through the Sinai Peninsula. Others may have crossed the southern end of the Red Sea during periods when sea levels were lower and coastlines looked very different. Yet the precise timing and importance of these routes remain uncertain. Some researchers favour repeated movement through northern corridors, while others emphasise southern coastal pathways. The debate is complicated because many ancient shorelines now lie beneath the sea, hidden by the rise in global water levels after the Ice Age. You imagine standing on a coast that no longer exists. The beach is broad, the tide low, and shellfish are abundant among the rocks. Smoke rises from small camps. Families move slowly along the shore, using marine food as a reliable resource while following the edge of the continent. Thousands of years later, the ocean covers their hearths, tools, and footprints. This loss creates one of the largest blind spots in early human history. Coastal environments may have supported important migrations, but much of the evidence is now submerged. Archaeologists can search caves and inland valleys, yet the most travelled shorelines may remain far offshore. You leave the river and climb toward a dry plateau. Evening light turns the rocks gold. The air cools rapidly, and the smell of smoke reaches you again, faint but unmistakable. Perhaps it comes from your own companions preparing a camp ahead. Perhaps it belongs to strangers. These routes were not empty. Other human populations were already living across Western Asia. Neanderthals occupied parts of the region during different periods, adapting to changing environments just as Homo sapiens did. The movement out of Africa was therefore not an entrance into an uninhabited world. It was an arrival into landscapes with older residents. Researchers continue to question whether early expansions failed because of climate, small population size, competition, or simple chance. A group might thrive for centuries and still leave no descendants. A drought could divide a population. A disease could weaken it. A later community might absorb it so completely that only faint genetic traces remained. Success in prehistory was rarely permanent. At the top of the plateau, you look back. The river is now a dark thread winding through the valley. Beyond it lie the lands your group has known. Ahead, the terrain becomes unfamiliar. You notice how quietly a boundary can be crossed. There is no gate, monument, or sign. One step places you on known ground. The next carries you into a landscape remembered only through stories told by travellers. The group gathers near a shallow rock shelter before nightfall. A small fire is built from dry branches. Its light warms the stone wall and reveals marks made by earlier visitors. Some are simple scratches, others may be natural cracks. You cannot tell. Food is passed around. Wet hides steam near the flames. A baby sleeps against someone's chest while the wind moves across the plateau outside. Perhaps this shelter has been used by several human groups over thousands of years. Each arrived during a different climate, left a few flakes of stone, and moved on. Their camps overlap in the earth, but their stories do not. The missing chapter grows deeper here. It lies not only in where people travelled, but in how many journeys ended without leaving a clear trace. You settle beside the fire and listen to the unfamiliar night sounds. A distant animal calls from the darkness. The stars rise above the plateau, appearing in the same patterns seen by people far behind you. Tomorrow, the group will continue east. There will be new rivers, colder mountains, strange animals, and other human beings already waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. You wake before sunrise beneath the shallow rock shelter. The fire has settled into a bed of red embers, and the air smells of ash, hide, and cold stone around you. People stir quietly. Someone adds a dry branch to the coals. Another checks the bindings on a wooden spear. Outside, the plateau lies beneath a faint silver light. You continue east as the sky brightens. The land changes slowly at first. Low scrub gives way to open grass, then to a series of rocky ridges. Wind moves through the valleys with the dry, steady sound. You hear pebbles shift beneath your feet and the distant cry of a bird circling above the slopes. This is not empty territory. Long before your group arrived, other human beings had learned these paths. They knew which caves remained dry in winter, where flint could be found, when herds crossed the passes, and where snow lingered longest in the mountains. Neanderthals were among those people. For many years, popular culture portrayed them as slow, clumsy, and barely intelligent. The old image placed them somewhere between an animal and a failed version of modern humanity. It was convenient, rather dramatic, and largely unfair. A mainstream historical fact is that Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They survived repeated climate shifts, hunted large animals, controlled fire, made sophisticated stone tools, and adapted to environments that could be bitterly cold. You climb toward a narrow pass. The wind sharpens as the ground rises. In shaded places, thin ice remains in cracks between stones. The valley below is broad and pale, with dark groups of animals moving across the grass. A Neanderthal watching from this ridge might read the scene with an expertise you do not possess. The direction of the herd, the speed of the wind, the cover provided by rocks, and the distance to shelter would all matter. Hunting was not a simple act of strength. It required planning, timing, cooperation, and a detailed understanding of animal behavior. Their bodies were strongly built, with broad chests and powerful limbs. These features may have helped conserve heat and support demanding physical activity in cold climates. Yet body shape alone did not keep anyone alive. Neanderthals also needed clothing, shelter, tools, firewood, and social cooperation. You reach the pass and pause beside a wall of dark stone. Marks on the ground suggest that people have rested here before. A few flakes of worked stone lie near the base of the rock. One flake is thin and sharp, removed deliberately from a prepared core. Neanderthal toolmaking was often associated with methods that required careful preparation. A stone core could be shaped so that the next strike produced a flake of a planned size and form. This was not random smashing. It involved sequence, memory, and control. Today, a broken phone screen can make a modern person feel briefly abandoned by civilization. Here, the failure of a cutting edge could delay food preparation, hide working, or spear repair. A reliable toolmaker was not simply handy. That person supported the survival of the group. You descend into the next valley as clouds gather overhead. The air smells of snow. Low trees cluster along a stream, their branches bare and dark. Near the water stands a limestone cave with a wide entrance. Inside, the light softens. The cave floor is dry near the back wall. Ash stains suggest repeated fires. Bones lie scattered in the earth, some broken for marrow. Stone tools and flakes rest among them. The evidence feels familiar. Yet the people who made it were not Homo sapiens. A lesser-known detail is that some Neanderthal sites contain evidence that injured or disabled individuals survived for years. Certain skeletons show healed wounds, severe dental loss, or physical conditions that would have made survival difficult without assistance. These remains suggest that group members sometimes cared for one another over long periods. You imagine an older person sitting near this fire, unable to hunt but still useful in other ways. Perhaps that person remembers migration routes, tool-making techniques, plant knowledge, or the behavior of animals during hard winters. Care is not necessarily charity. In a small community, memory itself is a resource. Scholars remain divided on the full extent of Neanderthal symbolic life. Some archaeological finds suggest the use of pigments, personal ornaments, feathers, claws, or marked objects. Critics caution that certain claims are difficult to prove or date securely. The evidence is fragmentary, and the meaning of any object can change depending on its context. You kneel beside the old hearth. Charcoal darkens your fingertips. It is easy to imagine warmth, food, conversation, and children drifting to sleep nearby. Yet it is harder to know what these people believed, feared, or hoped. Did they tell stories about the mountains? Did they name the stars? Did they remember ancestors in particular caves? No fossil can answer directly. The snow begins outside, light at first. Small flakes move across the cave entrance and disappear on the damp ground. You hear the soft hiss of wind passing over the rocks. Farther east and north lived the Denisovans, though their physical appearance remains far less certain. Much of what is known about them comes from genetic evidence and a small collection of fossil fragments. Their story demonstrates how incomplete the visible record can be. One of the most remarkable Denisovan finds is a small fragment of finger bone recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia. Genetic analysis revealed that it belonged to a previously unknown human population. A tiny piece of one individual opened an entire hidden branch of the family tree. You think of how easily such a fragment could have been missed. It might have remained in the sediment forever, or been mistaken for an ordinary piece of bone. The discovery depended on careful excavation, modern technology, and considerable luck. Denisovan genetic ancestry survives today in varying proportions among some populations in Asia and Oceania. Certain inherited variants may even have helped people adapt to high-altitude environments. This means ancient encounters were not only moments of contact. They sometimes left biological tools carried through thousands of years. The snow thickens beyond the cave mouth. White gathers on the stones and branches, you remain inside, listening. Across this enormous prehistoric world, human groups were scattered but not entirely isolated. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, and perhaps other unnamed populations occupied overlapping ranges at different times. Some vanished before ever being recognized in the fossil record. Others survive only through fragments of DNA. The idea of one humanity steadily replacing another begins to feel too simple. Instead, you see a braided river. Populations divide, travel, meet and separate. Some channels disappear into dry ground. Others join larger streams. A few continue into the present. As evening settles, you notice a faint light deeper within the cave. It may be only a reflection from the fire your companions have made. Or perhaps there are old marks on the wall catching the glow. You move closer, and for a moment, you imagine the strangers who once waited here while snow covered the valley. They were not failed versions of you. They were people adapted to their own worlds, carrying histories as deep as your own. Outside, the storm softens the landscape. Inside, the cave holds the quiet traces of lives that once seemed permanent. You move deeper into the cave as the snow continues outside. The light from the fire reaches only a short distance, leaving the far wall in shadow. Smoke gathers near the ceiling, and the air carries the mixed scent of damp limestone, old ash, animal hide, and melting snow. The marks you noticed are not paintings, they are shallow scratches, perhaps made by stone tools, perhaps by claws, perhaps by people whose intentions can no longer be recovered. You run your fingers near them without touching. Their uncertainty feels appropriate. This part of human history is filled with meetings that left only partial evidence. At some point, groups of Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthals. Elsewhere, other modern human populations met Denisovans. These contacts were not imagined possibilities. Genetic research shows that they happened. Many people living outside Africa today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations in Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan ancestry in varying amounts. These inherited fragments show that ancient human groups did not always remain separate. They met, formed relationships, had children, and continued together in ways that still echo through living bodies. You settle near the fire while snow gathers beyond the entrance. Someone places a hide over a gap where the wind enters. Another person rotates a piece of meat above the flames. Fat falls onto the coals and releases a warm, smoky smell. It is easy to imagine these meetings as rare dramatic events, with two human species suddenly facing one another across a valley. In reality, contact may often have been slower and more ordinary. One group might follow the same river corridor as another. They could notice footprints first, then smoke, then abandoned tools. Days or weeks might pass before they stood close enough to exchange food, gestures, or suspicion. The historical setting matters here. Populations were generally small, and communities were widely scattered. A group might contain only a few dozen people. Meeting outsiders could therefore carry enormous importance. Strangers brought risk, but they also brought information, new materials, possible partners, and knowledge of distant regions. You picture two camps on opposite sides of a shallow river. The first group has arrived from the south. Their tools are shaped in one style, their clothing cut in another. The second group has lived in the colder valley for generations. They know where animals cross in late winter and where dry wood can be found after heavy snow. At first, everyone watches. Children remain close to adults. Spears are held, but not raised. The river murmurs between them, creating a soft barrier that is easy to cross and difficult to ignore. Communication may begin through gesture. A hand points toward the mountains, someone lifts a piece of stone and indicates a distant source. Food is placed on the ground. A laugh, perhaps nervous, breaks the tension. No one knows how often scenes like this occurred. Archaeology can reveal shared technologies or changing tool traditions, but it rarely captures the exact moment when one person learned from another. Genetic evidence, however, confirms that some encounters became intimate. One intriguing detail is that early generations of mixed ancestry were not biological dead ends. Their descendants survived and contributed to later populations. Certain inherited traits may have affected immunity, skin biology, metabolism, or adaptation to local environments. Ancient contact was therefore not merely social, it sometimes helped newcomers survive in unfamiliar climates. You listen to the fire pop and imagine how useful local knowledge would have been. A group entering a colder region might benefit from learning which hides insulated best, how to store fuel, or when herds move through narrow valleys. Knowledge could travel through marriage, adoption, imitation, or simple observation. Modern people often imagine innovation as a sudden invention by one brilliant individual in prehistory. Improvement may have spread more quietly, through watching how another person tied a binding or placed stones around a hearth. Researchers disagree about how frequent interbreeding was and whether it happened during a few concentrated periods or through repeated contacts across long spans of time. Genetic patterns suggest more than one episode, but the full geography remains incomplete. Different populations may have met in Western Asia, Europe, Central Asia, and other regions not yet clearly identified. The difficulty lies partly in the small number of fossils. A few individuals cannot represent an entire continent. Each new discovery may shift the map. You leave the warmth of the central fire and move toward the cave entrance. Snow has stopped. The valley outside is quiet, covered in a thin white layer. Tracks lead away from the shelter. Some belong to your companions. Others are older and partly filled. You follow them down the slope. The cold air touches your face, and every sound seems sharper. Snow compresses beneath your feet with a dry whisper. A raven calls from a bare branch. Farther below, dark figures move near the river. They could be members of your own group. But in this imagined world, they are strangers. As you approach, small differences become visible. Their bodies are more compact, their faces are unfamiliar. Their clothing is made from thick hides, wrapped closely against the cold. One person carries a wooden spear with a carefully shaped stone point. The encounter feels tense, but not violent. Both groups have reasons to be cautious. Resources are limited. Winter is difficult, yet neither side can afford endless isolation. Small populations need connections. Partnerships can provide access to new hunting grounds, stone sources, and social networks. There is also curiosity. Human beings notice one another. They compare tools, voices, ornaments, movements, and expressions. A child may stare openly while adults pretend not to. A lesser-known possibility raised by archaeological research is that some personal ornaments or tool styles may have spread between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens communities. Whether these changes reflect direct teaching, imitation, independent invention, or deeper social contact remains uncertain. Still, material culture sometimes begins to look like conversation conducted through objects. You watch one of the strangers examine a blade from your group. The person turns it toward the light, tests the edge with a thumb, and gives a low sound of approval. In exchange, another tool is offered, heavier and shaped for a different task. No shared sentence is necessary. The objects speak first. Later, both groups sit near a fire built between large stones. Smoke rises into the still air. Meat warms over the flames. Someone passes a piece of roasted marrow. Children relax and move closer. Perhaps songs are exchanged. Perhaps gestures become words. Perhaps no one fully understands. Yet everyone recognizes hunger, warmth, fatigue, humor, and care. The missing chapter is especially deep here because relationships leave fewer traces than tools. Archaeologists may find two traditions in the same region, but they cannot easily reconstruct trust, affection, jealousy, negotiation, or belonging. A person born between communities may have moved comfortably through both. Another may have felt caught between languages and customs. These emotional lives are beyond recovery, yet they must have existed. You look across the fire at the unfamiliar faces. They are not abstractions called Neanderthal, Denisovan, or Homo sapiens. They are individuals. One has a scar near the eyebrow. Another keeps glancing toward the sleeping children. An older woman holds a polished stone that may have travelled far from its source. Night settles over the valley once more. The two groups remain beside the same fire, their shadows moving together across the snow. Above them, stars brighten through the cold air. Much of the evidence for this meeting will disappear. The wooden spears will rot. The hide shelter will collapse. The words will vanish immediately. But some part of the encounter will continue, hidden inside descendants who will carry it across thousands of years. The shared fire burns low as the night deepens around it. The two groups have grown quieter. Children sleep beneath folded hides. Adults sit with their hands extended toward the heat, listening to the wind move softly through the valley. No one here could know that traces of this meeting might remain inside people living tens of thousands of years later. You watch the flames bend and recover. The strangers across from you have their own ancestry, carried through countless generations. Your group has another, yet after this evening. Those lines may no longer remain separate. This is where the hidden history inside the human body becomes especially strange. For most of archaeology, researchers depended on visible remains, bones, teeth, stone tools, hearths, pigments, and ornaments formed the surviving record. If a population left no recognizable skeleton, it was almost impossible to know that population had existed. Genetics changed that. By studying DNA preserved in ancient remains and comparing it with the genomes of living people, scientists began finding signs of human groups that had never been clearly identified through fossils. These are sometimes called ghost populations, not because they were supernatural, but because their presence is inferred from genetic traces rather than a complete physical record. You rise from the fire and walk toward the river. Moonlight shines across the snow, turning the valley silver. Behind you, voices fade into the distance. Ahead, the water moves darkly between ice-covered stones. The basic principle is simple. When populations remain separated for long periods, their genetic patterns gradually become distinct. If they later meet and have children, fragments of those different ancestries can be carried forward. Thousands of years later, those fragments may still reveal that contact occurred. The details, however, are anything but simple. DNA breaks down over time, heat, moisture, soil chemistry, and contamination can destroy or confuse ancient genetic material. Cold caves and frozen ground sometimes preserve it better, but most human remains contain little usable information. Even so, a tooth or tiny bone fragment can contain enough evidence to transform the human family tree. One established finding is that some modern populations carry ancestry from archaic human groups beyond the better-known Neanderthals and Denisovans in parts of Africa. Genetic studies have detected patterns that may reflect interbreeding with ancient populations whose fossils have not yet been confidently identified. You step carefully across the river. Water slides over your ankles, shockingly cold, before you reach the opposite bank. The physical crossing lasts only moments. A genetic crossing can remain visible for hundreds of centuries. Across Africa, ancient human populations were probably structured into many regional communities. Some lived near forests, others beside lakes, grasslands, mountains, or coasts. They may have separated during harsh climatic periods and reconnected when environments became more favorable. This means human origins were not confined to one tiny place inhabited by one uniform population. Different regions may have contributed to the emergence of Homo sapiens over long periods through repeated contact and movement. Researchers use several models to explain this. Some propose a broadly connected African network in which populations separated and rejoined again and again. Others favor more localized origins followed by expansion. The evidence remains incomplete, and new genetic studies continue to reshape the discussion. You follow a trail through snow-covered grass. Small animal tracks cross your path. They appear, vanish beneath a drift, then reappear farther ahead. Ghost ancestry behaves in a similar way. It is not a complete portrait, it is a broken path. Scientists identify unusual genetic patterns, estimate when populations separated, and calculate when later mixing may have happened. The result can suggest an unknown group without revealing its face, language, or homeland. There is something deeply humbling about this. An entire population may survive in science as a statistical signal. You imagine the people behind that signal. They wake beside rivers, gather plants, repair tools, comfort children, and tell stories at night. Their communities may last for thousands of years. They may encounter neighboring groups, exchange food and partners, then gradually disappear as a distinct population. No one writes down their names. One little-known detail is that scientists can sometimes detect ancient population mixing without possessing DNA from the vanished group itself. They compare patterns across modern genomes and look for segments that seem too different to fit the known family tree. It is rather like finding unfamiliar handwriting in a copied manuscript when the original writer has been lost. Today, a family history service might produce a colourful chart and inform you that your ancestry contains several percentages, sometimes with suspicious confidence. Deep prehistory is far less cooperative. The farther back researchers look, the more populations overlap, divide, and blur into one another. The trail rises toward a rocky ledge. From there, you can see the campfires below. Two small circles of light glow near the river. One where the groups first met and another where some people have moved to sleep. Perhaps tomorrow they will separate again. A few individuals may leave with the newcomers, others may remain. A child born years later may inherit ancestry from both communities without ever hearing the full story of how they met. Genetic inheritance does not preserve memory. It preserves fragments of biological history. The distinction matters. A population can contribute genes and still lose its language, rituals, and identity. Another can disappear genetically while its technologies or stories continue among neighbors. Human history is not one thread. It is several threads woven together, some visible, some faded, some known only because the pattern changes where they once passed. Scientists continue to examine whether certain unexplained genetic signals represent one unknown population or several different groups. The answer may vary by region. Africa alone held enormous environmental diversity and deep human history, making a single hidden population unlikely to explain every pattern. Asia may have contained other unnamed groups as well. The Denisovans themselves may not have been one uniform population. Genetic evidence suggests deep divisions among Denisovan-related groups, perhaps spread across a wide geographical range. What science calls Denisovan ancestry may therefore represent several populations whose relationships were far more complicated than one label suggests. You descend from the ledge as clouds begin to cover the moon. The valley darkens. The fires below seem warmer now, their light reflected faintly on the river, near the camp. An older person is awake, feeding small branches into the flames. You sit nearby. No words are exchanged. The quiet is comfortable. You wonder what this person remembers. Perhaps there are stories of another group encountered many winters ago. Perhaps there are songs learned from a traveller whose descendants now live far away. Perhaps everyone here already carries ancestry from people they no longer recognize as distinct. The body remembers differently from the mind. It does not keep names, faces, or promises. It keeps variations copied from parent to child. Most are ordinary, some fade. Others remain because chance preserves them, or because they help people survive. Certain archaic genetic variants may have influenced immune responses, adaptation to altitude, or the way bodies handled unfamiliar environments. Yet not every inherited fragment was helpful. Some may have had no effect at all. Others could become less useful as lifestyles changed. Evolution is not a careful editor. It leaves notes in the margins, repeats passages, and occasionally keeps material no one understands. The fire releases a brief shower of sparks. They rise into the darkness and vanish. You look at the sleeping camp and think of the populations known only through genetic shadows. Their remains may still lie beneath forests, deserts, caves, or ocean floors. Perhaps none will ever be found. Still, they are not entirely gone. They persist in subtle patterns, hidden within living humanity. Quiet evidence that the past contained more people, more meetings, and more forgotten branches than any simple family tree can show. Morning arrives beneath a ceiling of low grey cloud. The camp beside the river wakes slowly, with small movements and quiet sounds. Someone shakes frost from a hide. Another person kneels beside the ashes and searches for a surviving ember. The river continues its steady passage between the stones, carrying yesterday's snowmelt toward places no one here has seen. You rise and walk away from the fire. The path leads across a damp meadow where the ground is soft beneath your feet. Each step leaves a clearer impression in the mud. For a moment, the marks seem permanent. They show the shape of your heel, the pressure of your toes, and the direction you're traveling. Then a light rain begins. Within minutes, water gathers inside the prints, Their edges soften, grass bends over them. By evening, much of the trail will be gone. This is how most of human history disappears. People sometimes imagine archaeology as a vast buried archive, with every ancient camp waiting to be uncovered if researchers simply dig in the correct place. In reality, the record is uneven, damaged, and selective. Preservation depends on soil, climate, chance, and the materials people used. Stone survives well, wood usually does not. Bone may endure in one cave and dissolve completely in another. Plant fibers, baskets, ropes, clothing, and shelters often vanish unless they are protected by unusually dry, frozen, or waterlogged conditions. The result is a silence stretching across enormous periods. You cross the meadow and enter a stand of trees. Rain taps softly on the leaves above. The earth smells rich and dark. Fallen branches lie beneath moss, already beginning to decay. Imagine a small community living here for several seasons. They build windbreaks from wood and brush. They weave containers from reeds. They make carrying nets, sleeping mats, cords, handles, and traps. Children play with carved wooden objects. Adults repair shelters after storms. Almost all of it disappears. Thousands of years later, an archaeologist may find only a few stone flakes and a patch of darkened soil. From those traces, the entire life of the camp must be carefully imagined. It is widely accepted that the archaeological record represents only a tiny fraction of past human behaviour. Most activities left no durable evidence, and many sites were destroyed before anyone could study them. Rivers changed course, caves collapsed, glaciers scraped across landscapes, wind buried camps under dunes, while erosion exposed others and carried them away. You stop beside a fallen tree. Its roots have lifted a wall of soil from the ground, inside the exposed earth. Layers appear as bands of brown, grey, and reddish clay. A thin black line may mark an ancient fire, or it may be charcoal from a natural wildfire. A few broken stones may be tools, or they may have fractured under pressure and frost. The past does not label its evidence. Archaeologists must compare shape, location, wear patterns, chemistry, and surrounding material. Even then, certainty can remain elusive. One object rarely explains itself. Meaning comes from context, and context is often the first thing erosion destroys. You continue through the trees until the trail reaches a shallow cave. Its entrance is narrow, partly hidden by hanging plants. Inside, the air is cool and still. Water drips somewhere in the darkness with a slow, regular rhythm. The cave floor contains layers deposited over thousands of years. Animals sheltered here, humans lit fires, wind carried dust inside, rain washed sediment from the entrance. Each occupation disturbed what came before. One unusual complication is that burrowing animals can move artifacts between layers. Rodents, insects, and other creatures dig through sediment, carrying small bones or stone flakes upward and downward. A tool found beside a fossil may therefore be much older or younger than it first appears. It is a modest detail, but it can transform an interpretation. You picture a researcher carefully brushing soil from a stone point, only to discover that a prehistoric rabbit may have rearranged the evidence. History has suffered less dignified interruptions. Deeper inside the cave, the floor becomes uneven. Pale mineral deposits cover parts of the wall. The remains of an old hearth sit near a protected corner, but the ash has been compressed into a thin, dark stain. How many people sat here? How long did they stay? Was this a winter home, a hunting stop, a meeting place, or a shelter used only during storms? The surviving evidence may support several answers. Specialists continue to disagree about how confidently short-term camps can be distinguished from longer occupations. A dense concentration of tools and bones may suggest repeated use, but repeated brief visits can create a similar pattern. A clean floor may indicate careful maintenance, or simply poor preservation. The same evidence can tell different stories depending on the assumptions brought to it. You leave the cave and follow a rocky slope toward open ground. The rain has weakened to mist far below. The river bends away between low hills. Across that landscape, countless sites remain invisible. Some are buried beneath several meters of sediment. Others lie beneath modern towns, farms, roads, and reservoirs. Many were destroyed long before archaeology existed as a discipline. Earlier excavators also worked differently from researchers today. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some sites were cleared rapidly, with limited recording of small objects, sediment layers, or environmental remains. Valuable information was lost because people did not yet know what future methods would be able to reveal. Tiny seeds, microscopic residues, fragments of charcoal, and traces of ancient proteins now provide evidence that earlier generations might have overlooked. The science improves, but the archive does not renew itself. Once a layer is excavated, it cannot be replaced. Archaeological digging is therefore both discovery and destruction. Researchers record each position, sample, and relationship as carefully as possible, because the original arrangement disappears during the work. You reach the open plain, where wind moves freely across wet grass. In the distance, animals graze near a patch of woodland. Their tracks overlap in the mud, creating a confused web of movement. Human sites can look much the same. Different groups may use the same location across centuries. Hearths are rebuilt. Older tools are picked up and reused. Bones are moved. Later visitors disturb earlier camps. What appears to be one community may actually represent many separated by generations. This is one reason the missing chapter cannot be filled with a single discovery. Each site is a small window, and the windows are scattered far apart. Between them lie centuries without evidence. You walk toward an abandoned camp near the riverbank. The fire is cold. A few cracked bones remain beside a circle of stones. There are no bodies, no names, and no explanation for why the people left. Perhaps the season changed, perhaps the river flooded, perhaps they joined another group or followed migrating animals, perhaps they intended to return and never did. Beside the hearth, you notice a small stone flake. It fits easily between your fingers. Someone struck it from a larger core and discarded it because it was not useful. That tiny act survived, while nearly everything the person valued disappeared. The irony is gentle but profound. Archaeology often preserves rubbish better than memory. You place the flake back where it lay and look across the quiet water. The silence in a record is not proof that nothing happened. It is evidence of how fragile ordinary life can be. Entire generations pass through these valleys, leaving behind stories, skills, friendships, and fears that no excavation will recover. The rain stops. Light spreads beneath the clouds, touching the river and the empty camp. You remain there for a little while, listening to water move past the stones. aware that beneath the soil may rest fragments of lives separated by long intervals of silence. Soon, the trail will lead you toward objects that survive more clearly than their makers. Stone tools will emerge from the earth, but the hands that shape them will remain uncertain. You leave the abandoned camp as the clouds begin to thin. Sunlight reaches the river in pale strips, and the wet stones along the bank shine softly. The small flake you examined remains beside the cold hearth. Quiet evidence of a hand that worked here long ago. Farther ahead, the ground rises toward a ridge of dark rock. The trail is scattered with broken stone, some shaped by frost, some by falling pressure, and some by deliberate human action. At first glance, the pieces seem almost identical. That is the difficulty. A stone tool survives when wood, fibre, leather, and bone have often disappeared. Because of this, prehistoric archaeology can become heavily dependent on objects made from stone. They are durable, common, and capable of preserving marks from the way they were shaped and used. Yet stone tools do not carry names. You kneel near the base of the ridge and pick up a pointed flake. Its edge is sharp. Small scars show where other flakes were removed. Someone understood the structure of this rock and struck it at a careful angle. The broader historical setting is one of repeated movement and contact. Different human groups occupied neighbouring regions, returned to the same stone sources, and sometimes used similar techniques. A style once associated with one population may later appear at a site connected to another. For years, archaeologists often matched particular tool industries with particular human species. Neanderthals were linked with certain Middle Paleolithic traditions, while Homo sapiens were associated with later blade technologies and ornaments. This framework was useful, but new discoveries have made the boundaries less secure. One reliable conclusion is that several human populations were capable of producing complex stone tools. Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and probably other groups all planned sequences of strikes, selected suitable raw materials, repaired tools, and transported useful stone across considerable distances. The presence of a sophisticated tool does not automatically identify its maker. You continue up the ridge. The rock here breaks into smooth, glassy surfaces. This would have been a valuable place. People may have travelled specifically to collect stone, returning over generations until the ground became littered with flakes. This sound of tool-making would have echoed between the slopes. Tap, pause, turn the core, tap again. A skilled maker did not simply hit one rock with another. The person studied the grain, prepared the striking surface, controlled force, and anticipated how the stone would fracture. One poor blow could ruin a piece carried from far away. Today, most people can replace a dull kitchen knife without consulting the geology of the neighbourhood. Prehistoric toolmakers had to understand material at a much more intimate level. You find a shallow hollow sheltered from the wind. Hundreds of flakes rest among the soil and grass. Some are waste. Others appear useful. A few show edges dulled by cutting, where analysis can reveal how certain tools were used. Microscopic polish may suggest contact with hide, wood, meat, or plant material. Residues can sometimes preserve traces of blood, starch, resin, or pigment. These clues provide remarkable detail. Though interpretation requires caution, a curious fact is that some stone points once classified as simple handheld tools may actually have been attached to wooden shafts. Tiny fractures near their bases can indicate impact. while traces of adhesive may show that plant resin or natural bitumen helped secure them. The wooden shaft has vanished, the binding has vanished, only the stone remains, carrying subtle evidence of the larger object it once formed. You imagine a craftsperson sitting in this hollow. A wooden spear lies across the knees. The point is set into a carved groove, wrapped with sinew and sealed with heated resin. Smoke drifts from a small fire used to soften the adhesive, without the stone tip. Later researchers might never know the spear existed. This creates a distorted picture of technology. Durable pieces survive, while the rest of the toolkit disappears. A collection of stone artifacts may represent only the replaceable edges of complex tools made mostly from organic materials. The trail continues beyond the ridge into a dry valley. On the ground, you notice several blades, long and narrow, removed from prepared cores. Their form looks different from the points found earlier. Archaeologists organize such patterns into industries or technological traditions. These categories help compare sites across regions and periods. They can reveal movement, learning, and cultural change. But categories can also create false certainty. Experts remain divided over whether some transitions in toolmaking reflect the arrival of new populations, the spread of ideas between existing groups, or independent invention under similar conditions. A new blade form might signal migration. It might also mean that local people learned from neighbors or developed a comparable solution on their own. The tools do not explain which possibility is correct. You walk deeper into the valley. Heat rises from the stones despite the cool air. A bird calls from the cliffs, and the sound repeats in distant echoes. Near an overhang, you discover another concentration of tools. Some belong to one technological style. Others resemble traditions found much farther away. The layers overlap closely. Perhaps different groups visited at separate times. Perhaps they met here. Perhaps one community adopted the methods of another. There is no clear answer. The makers themselves may not have thought in terms of rigid traditions. A person could learn one method as a child, encounter strangers later, then combine techniques. Innovation may have happened through practical borrowing rather than cultural replacement. You think back to the shared fire beside the river. One stranger examined a blade from another group. That simple moment could begin a technological change visible hundreds of years later. A tool style can travel without the people who first invented it. People can travel without keeping the styles they once used. This is why assigning artifacts to species becomes so uncertain during periods when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occupied overlapping regions at several sites. Ornaments and advanced tools appear near the final phases of Neanderthal occupation. Some scholars see evidence of independent Neanderthal innovation. Others suspect influence from incoming Homo sapiens. Both interpretations carry assumptions. The old idea that only modern humans could produce symbolic or complex objects has weakened. Neanderthals used pigments, selected unusual materials, and may have created decorative items. Still, the timing and context of individual finds can be difficult to establish. You sit beneath the overhang as afternoon light moves slowly across the valley floor. In your hand is a thin stone blade, its edges dulled by ancient work. Who made it? A young Homo sapiens learning from an older relative, a Neanderthal craftsperson, adapting a familiar method. Someone of mixed ancestry who would not fit neatly into either label. The object remains silent. One modest but revealing detail is that prehistoric toolmakers sometimes carried old or unusual stones over long distances. A tool could be resharpened repeatedly until little remained. Valuable pieces may have moved through exchange networks, passed from one person to another far from the original source. The stone in your hand may have travelled across mountains. Its maker may never have visited this valley. As evening approaches, you return the blade to the soil, the air cools, and shadows lengthen beneath the cliffs. Scattered tools catch the last light like small fragments of dark glass. They reveal intelligence, planning, movement, and labour. Yet they conceal identity. The missing chapter continues through this uncertainty. Archaeologists can reconstruct methods, compare edges, and trace raw materials back to distant quarries. They can sometimes determine what a tool cut and how it broke, but the person behind it remains just beyond reach. You leave the overhang and follow the valley toward a darker opening in the cliffs. Inside that shelter, pigments, shells, and carved objects wait in the earth. Stone will no longer be the only thing speaking. Soon, symbols will begin to appear. You enter the darker opening in the cliff as evening settles over the valley. The air inside is cooler, carrying the smell of mineral dust, old smoke, and damp stone behind you. The last daylight narrows into a pale blue shape at the cave entrance. Ahead, the walls curve inward, uneven and silent. At first, there seems to be nothing here except shadow. Then the firelight reaches a patch of red. You step closer. A stain of pigment lies across the stone, faded but deliberate, nearby. A series of lines follows the natural curve of the wall. Farther along, a hand shape appears beneath a thin layer of mineral deposits, as though someone once pressed a palm against the rock and breathed colour around it. These marks belong to a new kind of evidence. Stone tools reveal action, bones reveal diet, movement, illness, and death, pigments, ornaments, engravings, and images suggest something harder to measure. They suggest that people were not only surviving in the world, they were representing it. The historical background is complicated. Human beings had used pigments for a very long time before the great painted caves of Europe appeared. Pieces of ochre were collected, ground, scratched, and transported at sites in Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. Shell beads and engraved objects also appear deep in the record. Still, there are periods when symbolic artifacts seem to increase suddenly in number, variety, and geographical spread. One well-supported point is that by the Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens communities in parts of Europe created cave paintings, carved figures, musical instruments, beads, and decorated tools. Similar evidence of symbolic expression also existed earlier and elsewhere, particularly in Africa and Western Asia. The apparent bloom was not a single magical awakening. It was part of a longer, uneven history. You raise the fire closer to the wall, the image becomes clearer. An animal's back curves along a natural ridge in the stone. Its legs are suggested with a few dark strokes. The artist used the wall's surface rather than ignoring it. A bulge became muscle, a crack became the edge of a body. This required observation, planning, and imagination. The painter knew animals in motion. Perhaps the person had watched them run across open ground, turn suddenly near water, or lower their heads before charging. The image does not look like a casual doodle scratched while waiting for dinner. Then again, perhaps some marks were exactly that. Not every ancient line must carry a grand religious meaning. People have always made idle scratches, practiced shapes, copied one another, and decorated spaces simply because bare walls can feel rather dull after several winters. You continue through the cave. Water drips from the ceiling. The sound repeats softly, each drop followed by a faint echo. Your fire makes the painted animals seem to move as shadows pass across them. A lesser-known detail is that some cave images were placed in difficult, remote chambers far from ordinary living areas. Reaching them required crawling through narrow passages or carrying lamps deep underground. This suggests that at least some locations were chosen for special reasons. Why enter such darkness? Why paint where few people could easily see? Specialists have proposed many possibilities. The images may have been connected to ritual, storytelling, teaching, hunting beliefs, group identity, altered states, or ceremonies tied to particular places. Some interpretations focus on the animals depicted. Others examine sound, cave shape, handprints, or the relationship between images and natural features. No single explanation fits every site. The discussion remains open because symbolic behavior is difficult to reconstruct from objects alone. A painted horse might represent food, danger, beauty, ancestry, a spirit, a story, or several meanings at once. Even modern images can mean different things to different viewers, and modern viewers usually have captions. You move into a wider chamber. The ceiling rises above you, and the floor is uneven with stone. Here, several animals overlap. Some were painted at different times, perhaps generations apart. The cave was not a gallery completed in one season. It may have been revisited repeatedly. A child could have entered beside an older relative and seen images made before either of them was born. Later, that child might return as an adult and add another mark. The wall would become a layered memory, built slowly through contact between people and place. You imagine the scene. A stone lamp burns with animal fat. Its flame is small, producing more flicker than brightness. Someone grinds ochre on a flat stone. Another person mixes pigment with liquid, perhaps water, fat, or another binder. A third traces an outline with charcoal. The smell is smoky and close. Knees ache on the cold floor. The cave ceiling drips occasionally onto someone's hair. Sacred work, apparently, still involves uncomfortable working conditions. Beyond paintings, people created personal ornaments. Shells were pierced and strung. Teeth and beads were worn on clothing or around the body. Pigments may have coloured skin, objects, or garments. Such items could communicate identity without words. They might show age, status, kinship, group membership, or personal preference. A bead made from a distant shell could also reveal contact across wide social networks. The object itself is small, but its journey may be long. You find several shells in the sediment near the chamber entrance. The sea lies far away. Someone carried them here, or received them through exchange. Their presence suggests that prehistoric communities were connected beyond the immediate valley. This wider network may have mattered greatly during difficult periods. If local food failed, distant relationships could provide information, shelter, or access to new territory. Ornament exchange may therefore have been more than decoration. It may have helped maintain social bonds. Researchers continue to ask why symbolic artifacts become especially visible in certain periods. One view emphasizes changes in cognition or language. Another stresses population growth, wider networks, competition between groups, or the need to signal identity among strangers. It is also possible that earlier symbolic traditions existed but were made from perishable materials that did not survive. A painted hide disappears, a carved wooden mask rots, a song leaves no layer in the soil. The apparent suddenness may partly reflect preservation rather than invention. You sit beside the chamber wall and listen to the cave. In one corner, the acoustics change. A quiet hum returns as a deeper echo. Some researchers have noticed that painted areas in certain caves correspond with unusual sound qualities, raising the possibility that music, chanting, or rhythm formed part of the experience. Bone flutes have also survived from parts of Upper Paleolithic Europe. They show that people made instruments capable of producing controlled tones. Music, like imagery, suggests shared attention and emotional life. You picture a low melody moving through the chamber. The sound gathers against the walls, passes beneath the painted animals, and returns softened. People sit close together in the dark. The meaning may be ceremonial, educational, playful, or all of these at once. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, the marks remain. The so-called creative explosion was not necessarily an explosion at all. It may have been a gradual accumulation that becomes visible only when enough evidence survives. Symbolic behavior could have appeared, faded, changed form, and reappeared among different populations. You stand and begin walking back toward the cave entrance. The painted hand remains behind you, small and unmistakably human. It does not explain itself. It simply says that someone was here. Someone who understood absence and presence well enough to leave the shape of a hand without the hand itself. As you step into the cool night, you carry that image with you. The symbols on the cave wall have survived, but the stories spoken beneath them are gone. To follow those stories, you must now enter a world where memory travelled through voices rather than stone. You leave the painted cave just before dawn. A faint band of silver stretches across the eastern horizon, while the stars slowly surrender to the coming light. The air feels cool against your skin, carrying the scent of damp stone, wild grass, and the fading smoke from last night's fire. Behind you remain the painted hands, the red ochre, and the quiet animals resting forever on cave walls. Ahead lies another mystery, one that left almost no physical trace at all. You begin walking along a narrow ridge overlooking a broad valley. Mist settles in the low ground like a pale river. Small birds call from scattered bushes. Somewhere below, water flows over rounded stones with a gentle rhythm that blends into the morning silence. The valley appears peaceful. Yet the greatest inventions in human history may already exist here, even though none can be seen. Language, memory, teaching, stories. Unlike stone blades or painted caves, these remarkable achievements leave almost nothing for archaeologists to uncover. A spoken sentence disappears the instant it is finished. A lesson given beside a fire vanishes into the air. A story repeated for generations leaves no fossil, and yet those invisible things may have shaped humanity more profoundly than any spear ever could. You descend toward a cluster of trees growing beside a stream. Several people from your travelling group have already begun gathering fallen branches for the morning fire. Others inspect footprints pressed into damp soil during the night. Nobody works alone for very long. One person points silently toward fresh deer tracks. Another nods, without lengthy discussion. Several adults begin preparing for the day's hunt. This effortless cooperation hints at something deeper than instinct, shared understanding. Researchers broadly agree that early humans depended upon social learning to an extraordinary degree. Skills such as making stone tools, preparing animal hides, identifying edible plants, building shelters, and organizing hunts could not simply be rediscovered every generation. They had to be passed from experienced individuals to younger ones. Knowledge itself became a survival tool. You watch an older woman kneel beside a young child holding 2 pieces of flint. She does not seize the stones and demonstrate everything herself. Instead, she places the child's hands in the proper position. She adjusts the angle. She waits. The child strikes too hard. The stone breaks poorly. Nobody becomes angry. The lesson begins again. Perhaps it takes weeks before the child learns how to control each blow. Years later, that same child may teach another generation exactly the same movements. In this quiet exchange, information survives far longer than any individual. One particularly fascinating discovery comes from experimental archaeology. Modern researchers who attempt to recreate ancient stone tools have found that certain techniques are surprisingly difficult to master through observation alone. Clear instruction dramatically improves success. This suggests that prehistoric teaching may have been more sophisticated than once imagined. You smile to yourself. Anyone who has ever tried assembling unfamiliar furniture using only tiny pictures can appreciate the value of good explanations. You continue walking beside the stream. Dragonflies skim the water's surface. Reed stems bend gently in the breeze. The landscape feels timeless, yet each person moving through it carries an invisible library inside the mind. They remember where edible roots grow after heavy rain. They remember which valley floods during spring. They remember which berries make children sick. They remember which caves remain dry through winter. Every memory increases the group's chance of survival. Unlike instinct, this knowledge can expand. Each generation inherits discoveries made by countless generations before. You pause beside an enormous fallen tree. Its trunk has become soft with age. Moss covers the bark, while mushrooms grow from cracks in the wood. Nature constantly recycles itself. Human knowledge works differently. Instead of beginning again from nothing, people gradually build upon what earlier generations learned. Fire becomes easier to manage. Tools become more refined. Hunting strategies improve. Travel routes become familiar. Medicinal plants are remembered. The accumulation is slow, but remarkably powerful. Of course, not every lesson survives. Entire communities sometimes disappear. A harsh winter, a prolonged drought, disease, conflict, migration into unfamiliar territory. When a small population is lost, its unique knowledge may disappear with it. The missing chapter of human history therefore includes not only forgotten people, but forgotten ideas. Perhaps one group discovered a more efficient way to preserve meat. Perhaps another developed a method for weaving stronger carrying nets. Perhaps someone understood the seasonal movement of fish better than anyone else. If those communities vanished without passing on their knowledge, those discoveries vanish too. The evidence allows more than one explanation for how rapidly ideas spread between prehistoric populations. Some researchers emphasize regular contact between neighboring groups. Others believe many innovations remained local for surprisingly long periods. Small populations separated by mountains, deserts, forests, or glaciers could remain culturally distinct for thousands of years. You stop beside a small clearing where several children are playing. One child pretends to stalk another using a tiny stick as a spear. Another gathers smooth stones and arranges them in careful rows. An older sibling laughs softly and demonstrates a better throwing motion. Play becomes practice. Practice becomes skill. Skill becomes survival. Children may have learned much of adult life long before they were expected to hunt or gather independently. The clearing fills with quiet laughter. Even here, learning rarely feels like formal instruction. It happens naturally through watching, copying, correcting, and trying again. There is another subtle clue hidden within archaeological sites. Stone tools sometimes show remarkably consistent craftsmanship across large regions and many generations. Such consistency suggests reliable teaching traditions rather than isolated acts of invention. Techniques remained recognizable because experienced toolmakers successfully passed them onward. You continue through open woodland where sunlight filters between scattered branches. A squirrel darts across a fallen log, somewhere overhead. Birds exchange calls too quick for you to follow. Human speech may once have sounded equally mysterious to neighboring groups. No recordings survive, no written vocabulary remains, no grammar books were carved into stone. Scientists can reconstruct the anatomy of ancient throats, tongues, ears, and skulls to estimate speech capability. Genetic evidence involving genes associated with language also contributes important clues. Together, these findings suggest that our ancestors possessed sophisticated vocal abilities far earlier than once believed. Exactly when language reached its modern complexity, however, remains one of prehistory's most intriguing unanswered questions. Perhaps language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. Perhaps important breakthroughs occurred within expanding social networks. Perhaps several different communication systems existed before eventually blending or replacing one another. The conversation continues because direct evidence simply does not survive. You arrive at another evening camp. The fire burns warmly beneath a circle of stones. People gather close together as darkness slowly returns. No paintings cover these nearby rocks. No ornaments lie scattered across the ground. Nothing here seems especially remarkable. Yet after the meal, an elderly man begins speaking. Everyone becomes still. Children lean against their parents. Faces glow softly in the firelight. Perhaps he tells of a dangerous valley where lions hunt after sunset. Perhaps he remembers a drought from long ago. Perhaps he explains why the stars change with the seasons. Or perhaps he simply tells a funny story about a clumsy hunter who slipped into a muddy river while trying to impress everyone. The exact words are forever lost. Their importance is not. Long after the fire burns down and the camp disappears beneath wind, rain, and growing grass. The story itself may continue in other voices. One child remembers it, then another, and somewhere within those repeated evenings, knowledge crosses centuries without leaving a single artifact behind. As the stars brighten above the quiet camp, you begin to understand that the missing chapter of human history was written not only on stone walls, but inside countless conversations that vanished the moment they were spoken. Their echoes may be gone. Their influence never truly disappeared. The last voices around the fire gradually fade into the night. One by one, people settle beneath animal hides, curling close to the warmth of the embers. Above the camp, countless stars fill the clear sky. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a pale river, just as it did for generations long before anyone imagined kingdoms, writing, or cities. You remain awake a little longer. The fire has become quieter now, every so often. A piece of wood shifts with a gentle crack, sending a handful of sparks drifting upward before they disappear into the darkness. Across the valley, another fire glows faintly. Perhaps it belongs to strangers. Perhaps it belongs to people you met several seasons ago. Or perhaps it is empty now, left behind after yesterday's journey. As you watch those distant lights, another mystery begins to unfold. The world that once held many kinds of humans slowly became a world occupied by only one. Neanderthals disappeared. The Denisovans faded from the visible record. Other ancient populations also vanished, leaving only scattered clues hidden beneath caves, river banks, and frozen ground. You might expect such an enormous event to have one dramatic explanation. Instead, the story becomes quieter the closer you examine it. One conclusion, supported by discoveries across Europe and Western Asia, is that Neanderthals disappeared approximately 40,000 years ago. Although the exact timing varied from region to region, their final population survived longer in some places than others, suggesting that extinction was not one sudden event sweeping across an entire continent. It unfolded unevenly. Some valleys may have remained occupied while neighbouring regions had already become empty. You leave the sleeping camp just after sunrise. Morning mist hangs low over the grasslands. Frost sparkles along the edges of small plants before melting beneath the first rays of sunlight. The trail leads toward rolling hills where patches of woodland alternate with open plains. As you walk, you imagine these same hills thousands of years earlier, Neanderthal families gathering firewood, children following older relatives during hunting trips, stone tools being repaired beside streams, ordinary lives continuing season after season. None of those people could have known they belonged to one of humanity's final Neanderthal generations. History rarely announces its endings. An overlooked clue comes from population genetics. Many researchers believe Neanderthal communities became increasingly small and isolated during their final millennia. Small populations face particular challenges. Fewer potential partners reduce genetic diversity. Random events become more dangerous. A single harsh winter or failed hunting season can affect a much larger proportion of the community. Imagine a valley supporting 30 people. If several experienced hunters are lost during one difficult year, the impact extends far beyond immediate survival. Knowledge disappears, children lose teachers, food becomes scarcer, recovery grows harder. You climb a rocky slope where cold wind moves steadily between scattered boulders. From this height, the landscape appears vast, wide enough that two neighbouring groups might never meet for years, isolated enough that entire populations could quietly vanish without anyone recording the event. There is no universal agreement about why Neanderthals disappeared. Climate almost certainly played a role. Environmental conditions shifted repeatedly, altering forests, grasslands, and animal distributions. Large prey species changed their ranges. Habitats became fragmented. Communities that had adapted successfully for thousands of years suddenly faced unfamiliar conditions. Yet climate alone cannot explain everything. Homo sapiens experienced many of the same environmental changes and survived. Some specialists emphasize competition for resources. Others point toward differences in social networks. Still others focus on demographic patterns, disease, technological flexibility, or combinations of several factors working together over many generations. The evidence refuses to support one simple answer. You descend toward a narrow valley where fresh water flows beneath overhanging trees. Animal tracks crisscross the muddy bank. Some belong to deer, others to wolves. Still others are too blurred to identify. Human history often looks exactly like these overlapping footprints. Different events leave marks that cross one another until separating them becomes nearly impossible. You stop beside a weathered cave entrance. Inside lies another abandoned hearth. Charcoal, broken bones, stone flakes. Nothing unusual. Yet every abandoned campsite raises the same quiet question. Was this place left because the people moved elsewhere, or because no one remained to return? A fascinating observation comes from archaeological surveys showing that some regions gradually contain fewer Neanderthal sites through time rather than ending abruptly. Camps become rarer, occupied territories shrink. Eventually, only isolated pockets remain before disappearing entirely. The pattern resembles a candle slowly burning lower rather than being blown out all at once. You sit near the old hearth. The ashes are cold. A few small plants have begun growing through cracks between the stones. Nature wastes very little space. Places abandoned by one generation quickly become home for another. Perhaps several decades after this camp was left, a group of Homo sapiens arrived here. They repaired the fire pit, collected fresh wood, cooked another meal. Children laughed in almost the same place where Neanderthal children once played. The cave itself remained unchanged. Its occupants did not. You continue through the valley as afternoon sunlight warms the air. Birdsong becomes more frequent. The snow from earlier sections of your journey feels like a distant memory, reminding you how greatly climates and landscapes could differ across prehistoric Eurasia. Another possibility sometimes discussed involves social networks. Larger populations connected across broader territories may recover more easily after local disasters. If one valley suffers poor hunting, neighbouring communities can sometimes provide support, exchange partners, or share information. Smaller, isolated populations have fewer such opportunities. Researchers continue examining whether expanding Homo sapiens networks provided long-term resilience that gradually outweighed the advantages Neanderthals had developed in colder environments. The answer almost certainly varies from place to place. Some encounters were peaceful, others may have involved competition. Still others ended in families joining together, leaving descendants whose DNA survives today. Human history rarely chooses only one path. You pause beside a fallen tree stretching across a shallow stream. Moss covers its trunk. Tiny flowers bloom nearby. The scene feels calm. It is strangely comforting to remember that extinction is not always accompanied by catastrophe. Sometimes populations decline quietly across many generations. Fewer births, longer journeys between neighbouring camps, more empty valleys. Eventually, children grow up never meeting people their grandparents once knew. Memory fades before biology does. As evening approaches, you reach a broad overlook. Far below, several small columns of smoke rise into the still air. Some belong to your own companions, others belong to unfamiliar travellers. The landscape remains alive. Only the balance between its inhabitants has changed. You realize something important. Neanderthals did not fail because they lacked intelligence. They survived hundreds of thousands of years through repeated environmental upheaval. They adapted remarkably well to demanding conditions. Their disappearance tells us less about weakness than about how unpredictable history can become when climate, population size, geography, and chance begin influencing one another across thousands of years. The firelight from the camps below grows brighter as darkness settles. Somewhere among those flames, Children are listening to stories. Some carry Neanderthal ancestry without knowing it. Others inherit traditions shaped by many forgotten encounters. The people themselves cannot see the larger pattern. Only from the immense distance of time does it become visible. You remain on the hillside until the stars return. The ancient world has become quieter than before. Not because fewer people remain alive tonight, but because one branch of humanity is slowly fading into memory, leaving behind only scattered traces that future generations will spend centuries trying to understand. You remain on the hillside as the night settles gently across the valley. The campfires below have become tiny orange circles surrounded by darkness. Their smoke rises straight into the calm air before disappearing beneath the stars. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls once. Then the valley grows quiet again. The silence feels different now, not empty, merely patient. The disappearance of other human groups has left the landscape changed. Yet the story of Homo sapiens is still far from secure. It is easy to imagine our ancestors steadily increasing in number until they eventually filled every continent. The evidence suggests something much less comfortable. There were moments when our own species came surprisingly close to disappearing as well. You begin walking before sunrise, following a narrow trail along the crest of the ridge. Frost sparkles on the grass, and each breath forms a pale cloud in the cold morning air. Below you, the valley slowly fills with golden light, revealing winding streams, scattered trees, and distant herds beginning another day. The world looks peaceful, yet hidden within human DNA are clues that point toward ancient times when remarkably few people may have remained alive. Genetic research has consistently shown that modern humans pass through periods of extremely low population size. These events, often called population bottlenecks, reduced genetic diversity before later populations expanded once again. The exact numbers remain uncertain. Some estimates suggest only a few thousand breeding individuals survived during certain periods. Other proposed bottlenecks involve even smaller effective populations, though these figures describe genetic diversity rather than a simple head count of everyone alive. Either way, humanity's future was never guaranteed. You descend toward a broad plain where mist still clings to the ground. Fresh tracks cross the damp earth. Deer, foxes, wild horses, and human footprints. Only a handful. The small number suddenly feels significant. A community of 20 or 30 people might represent nearly everyone you know. Another group may live several days away. A third, perhaps beyond the mountains. The distance between surviving populations could become enormous when climate changed or resources became scarce. One especially intriguing discovery comes from genetic studies suggesting that ancient population sizes fluctuated far more dramatically than researchers once imagined. Human history may have included repeated contractions followed by recoveries rather than one steady upward climb. Imagine a woven cloth. Sometimes threads are added. Sometimes entire sections become thin enough that light shines through. The cloth survives, but only just. You continue walking until you reach a shallow lake bordered by reeds. Morning birds skim across the still water. Fish disturb the smooth surface with quiet ripples. Nearby, several people gather edible plants while others inspect the shoreline for animal tracks. Nothing about the scene suggests danger. That is precisely how slow demographic change often appears. A community does not suddenly realize that humanity has entered a bottleneck. People simply notice that neighboring camps have not returned. Travel routes become quieter, Seasonal gatherings grow smaller. Fewer unfamiliar faces appear each year. Children hear stories about relatives living beyond distant hills whom they never actually meet. The change unfolds slowly enough that each generation accepts it as ordinary. The reasons behind these population declines remain uncertain. Climate certainly influenced food availability and migration routes. Volcanic eruptions may have affected regional environments. Disease could have spread through connected communities. Periods of prolonged drought reduced water supplies. Social fragmentation may have separated populations that once exchanged partners and knowledge. Chance itself probably played an important role. Several modest difficulties occurring together over many generations can reshape history more effectively than one dramatic disaster. Today, losing your internet connection for 20 minutes can feel like civilization itself has entered a bottleneck. Our ancestors faced considerably more complicated logistical problems. You smile quietly as you continue along the lakeshore. A child kneels beside the water, carefully examining tiny freshwater shells. An older woman points toward edible reeds growing farther along the bank. Knowledge continues flowing between generations despite every hardship. That quiet exchange may be just as important as finding food. When populations become small, preserving knowledge becomes increasingly valuable. Every experienced hunter matters. Every skilled toolmaker matters. Every healer who remembers useful plants matters. Every storyteller who remembers safe travel routes matters. The death of one knowledgeable elder could remove decades of accumulated experience from the community. You pause beneath a cluster of trees where several people are repairing baskets woven from reeds and flexible branches. The baskets themselves will almost certainly disappear after enough centuries. The weaving techniques may survive much longer. This contrast appears again and again throughout prehistory. Objects perish. Skills endure only if someone learns them. A subtle clue supporting this idea comes from the remarkable continuity seen in some technological traditions. Certain manufacturing methods persisted across astonishing spans of time, suggesting stable systems of teaching despite environmental uncertainty. Such continuity becomes even more impressive if populations were occasionally reduced to relatively small numbers. You continue through open woodland as sunlight grows warmer. The trees here are widely spaced, allowing patches of grass to flourish beneath them. Birdsong fills the air. Everything feels calm. Yet beneath this peaceful landscape lies another question. Did some knowledge disappear forever during these bottlenecks? The answer may never be known. Perhaps earlier populations developed techniques that later generations forgot completely. Perhaps certain artistic traditions vanished without leaving surviving examples. Perhaps medicinal knowledge disappeared after the last experienced healer died. The archaeological record occasionally shows technologies appearing, disappearing, and reappearing across different regions. Sometimes this reflects changing conditions, sometimes independent invention, sometimes migration, sometimes loss. Distinguishing among those possibilities remains extremely difficult. You reach another rocky overlook by late afternoon. Below, several narrow valleys spread toward the horizon. Each could shelter a small community. Each might remain isolated for generations. Each might preserve unique customs invisible to archaeology. Human diversity probably extended far beyond what surviving artifacts suggest. Languages differed, stories differed, songs differed, ways of greeting strangers almost certainly differed. Some groups may have feared mountains, others may have considered them sacred. Some may have followed rivers, others trusted the stars. Very little of that cultural richness survives. The physical evidence is only the outer shell of ancient life. You sit upon a sun-warmed stone and watch shadows lengthen across the valleys. The landscape seems endless. Yet somewhere beyond those distant hills may live another small community, unaware that they belong to one of humanity's few remaining branches. They are not trying to preserve the species. They are simply trying to survive another winter. History often advances through such ordinary intentions. Evening approaches slowly. The air cools once more. A small group begins preparing camp nearby. Branches are gathered. A fire is lit. Children laugh while chasing one another between scattered rocks. Someone begins shaping a fresh stone point. Someone else quietly hums a melody while scraping an animal hide. The scene feels wonderfully ordinary. That ordinary quality may be the greatest reason humanity endured. People continued teaching, continued caring for children, continued sharing food, continued repairing tools, continued telling stories after difficult seasons. Civilizations would eventually rise thousands of years later, but their deepest foundations were built here, among small, resilient communities refusing to surrender their accumulated knowledge despite repeated hardship. You look toward the fire as darkness settles across the hills. Its warm glow reaches only a short distance into the night. Beyond that circle of light stretches a vast world filled with uncertainty. Yet inside the circle sits everything necessary for the future: memory, cooperation, patience, hope. Humanity survived not because the path was easy, but because countless generations quietly protected those invisible treasures, passing them from one evening to the next until the long night of prehistory slowly gave way to a new chapter. The fire burned steadily through the night, casting a warm glow across the circle of sleeping figures beyond its light. The hills dissolve into darkness, their outlines softened beneath a sky crowded with stars. A cool breeze carries the scent of damp earth and distant water. Somewhere far below, a river continues its patient journey toward a coastline that, in your own time, no longer exists. You wake just before dawn. The eastern sky is still grey when the first birds begin to sing. Dew clings to every blade of grass, and the air feels fresh after the long night. Your companions gather their belongings with practiced efficiency. Nothing unnecessary is carried. Every hide, every tool, every bundle of food has earned its place. Today's journey leads toward the sea. As the hills gradually fall away, the air changes. It becomes softer, carrying the unmistakable smell of salt. The wind grows steadier, and faint cries of seabirds drift inland long before the water itself comes into view. When you finally reach the coastline, it looks astonishingly different from the shores familiar today. The beach stretches much farther outward. Broad plains extend where modern waves would eventually roll. Rivers empty into distant channels across land that will one day lie beneath dozens of meters of seawater. This vanished world remained hidden until scientists began studying ancient sea levels. During the Ice Age, enormous quantities of Earth's water were locked inside continental ice sheets. As a result, global sea levels stood much lower than they do today, exposing vast coastal landscapes that people could walk across for thousands of years. You stand at the edge of this ancient shoreline. Gentle waves break against smooth sand. Small shellfish cling to exposed rocks. Tidal pools shimmer beneath the morning sun, filled with tiny fish, crabs, and seaweed. Food is everywhere. Unlike large game, shellfish cannot run away. Fish often return with predictable tides. Seabirds reveal productive feeding grounds. Coastal environments offered remarkably reliable resources for people willing to learn their rhythms. This helps explain why many researchers believe ancient shorelines played an important role in human expansion. You walk beside the water while several members of the group gather shellfish into woven baskets. Others search among rocks for stranded fish left behind by the retreating tide. Children laugh as small waves splash against their ankles. The work feels almost peaceful. No dangerous hunt. No exhausting chase across open plains. Simply patience and careful observation. An especially interesting clue comes from coastal archaeological sites where enormous shell middens have survived. These ancient refuse heaps contain millions of discarded shells, revealing that some communities relied heavily upon marine resources for remarkably long periods. To modern eyes, a pile of shells may appear unimpressive. To archaeologists, it can preserve centuries of meals, seasonal habits, environmental change, and human activity. You kneel beside one tidal pool. Tiny creatures dart between seaweed. Bright green algae sway gently beneath the clear water. The entire shoreline feels alive. Yet something immediately strikes you. Very little evidence remains. Wooden fish traps would eventually rot. Plant fiber nets disappear. Simple boats decay completely. Even footprints vanish with the next tide. The coast provides abundant resources while preserving surprisingly little of everyday life. This creates one of prehistory's greatest challenges. As the Ice Age ended, glaciers melted across much of the world. Sea levels rose gradually over thousands of years. The process was slow enough that individual generations could adapt, but relentless enough that entire coastlines eventually disappeared beneath the ocean. Everything built there followed. Ancient camps, fireplaces, tool workshops, sleeping places, meeting grounds, all submerged. You continue walking along the beach until you reach the mouth of a broad river. Fresh water mixes with seawater in slow swirling currents. Fish gather here in remarkable numbers. Birds circle overhead. The place practically invites settlement. One conclusion supported by underwater archaeology is that many prehistoric coastal sites almost certainly remain hidden beneath modern seas. Researchers have already discovered submerged landscapes, ancient river channels, forests, and evidence of human occupation in several parts of the world. Yet exploring these drowned environments is extraordinarily difficult. Visibility is often poor. Sediment buries ancient surfaces. Strong currents complicate excavation. Many locations remain completely inaccessible. You imagine an entire prehistoric valley now resting beneath quiet blue water. Families once gathered around fires there. Children learned to fish beside streams. Dogs may have followed hunters along sandy paths. Now fish swim above those forgotten camps. The transformation happened so gradually that no single generation witnessed the full loss. Each lifetime simply moved camp a little farther inland. Another subtle piece of evidence comes from submerged forests occasionally revealed by storms along modern coastlines. Ancient tree stumps, preserved beneath layers of sediment, briefly emerge before tides cover them once again. These forests remind us that landscapes familiar to prehistoric people now lie hidden beneath the sea. You continue inland for a short distance where low dunes overlook the shoreline. From here, you can watch people moving below. Some repair baskets, others shape bone fish hooks, a few scrape hides stretched across wooden frames. The camp appears busy, yet unhurried. Life beside the sea follows rhythms different from those of inland hunters. Tides replace migrations. Storms become more important than snowfall. Knowledge shifts accordingly. A skilled coastal elder may predict changing currents with astonishing accuracy. Another recognizes dangerous waves by subtle changes in wind. Children learn which shellfish remain safe to eat and which creatures should never be touched. These lessons become as valuable as tracking large animals across grasslands. Exactly how important coastal migration routes were continues to encourage lively discussion among researchers. Some favor extensive shoreline travel stretching across southern Asia. Others believe inland routes carried greater importance during different periods. Perhaps both pathways mattered, depending upon climate, geography, and available resources. The answer may differ from one century to the next. History rarely rewards simple either-or explanations. You sit upon a weathered log while the afternoon sun glitters across the water. A group of children discovers an unusually shaped shell. They pass it from hand to hand with quiet excitement. One finally threads it onto a simple cord. A new ornament has entered the community. Its value lies not in wealth, but in memory. Many years from now, someone else may wear that same shell while telling stories beside another fire. Unless, of course, it is lost to the sea. The ocean has always possessed remarkable patience. It gives food generously. It also reclaims almost everything left beside it. As evening approaches, the tide begins rising. Water slowly covers the places where you walked earlier that morning. Footprints disappear first, then shallow fire pits. Small piles of shells become submerged. The sea leaves no dramatic announcement. It simply continues its ancient work, watching the waves advance. You realize the missing chapter of human history may not be missing because people failed to leave evidence. Perhaps they left enormous amounts. Much of it simply rests beneath thousands of years of rising water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, drowned valleys still preserve silent camps waiting to be discovered. Stone tools remain where hands once dropped them. Fireplaces rest beneath layers of sand. Ancient rivers continue their invisible courses beneath the sea. The coastline grows quieter as twilight settles over the water. Your companions gather around another evening fire set safely above the highest tide. Behind you stretches the land. Before you stretches the sea. Between them lies one of humanity's greatest forgotten landscapes, hidden not by mystery alone, but by the slow, patient rise of the ocean itself. The waves whisper softly against the shore as night settles over the coast. The campfire flickers behind you, its warm glow reflected in polished shells scattered across the sand. The tide has reached its highest point, quietly covering places where people stood only a few hours before, out on the dark water. The moon paints a silver path that seems to stretch toward an unseen horizon. You remain awake for a while, listening. The sea breathes in, the sea breathes out. Its rhythm is steady enough to make even the most restless thoughts slow down. Before long, dawn begins to brighten the eastern sky. The first light reveals a coastline glistening with the moisture. Seabirds glide low above the water, already searching for breakfast. Behind the beach, rolling grasslands stretch inland, dotted with small clusters of trees and winding streams. Your companions begin another ordinary morning. Someone checks woven fish traps placed near the tidal pools. Others gather driftwood carried ashore during the night. Children race ahead searching for smooth stones while adults quietly prepare baskets and digging sticks. The day feels peaceful. It would be easy to imagine prehistoric hunter-gatherers as constantly wandering without plans or permanent connections to any place. The evidence tells a more thoughtful story. Archaeological research has revealed that many hunter-gatherer communities returned repeatedly to favoured locations, rich fishing grounds, dependable springs, sheltered valleys, productive forests, and reliable stone sources often became seasonal homes visited again and again across generations. Movement existed. So did familiarity. You leave the shoreline and follow a narrow path inland. The trail winds through flowering grass before reaching a broad meadow surrounded by gentle hills. Near its centre stands a circle of old fire pits, although abandoned at the moment. The place carries subtle signs of repeated occupation. The soil is darker. Small fragments of charcoal remain beneath the surface. Animal bones appear in scattered clusters. Stone flakes glimmer where sunlight reaches them. This place has welcomed many returns. Rather than building permanent cities, these communities often created seasonal landscapes shaped by memory. Certain camps might be used during spring fishing, others during autumn hunting, and still others when particular fruits or nuts reached maturity. The calendar lived in the environment itself. You imagine the conversations when the wild berries ripen. We return to the northern valley. When the salmon arrive, we gather beside the river. When the snow begins, we move toward the limestone caves. The land itself becomes a schedule. One remarkable observation from archaeological surveys is that some hunter-gatherer camps contain evidence of repeated occupation spanning hundreds or even thousands of years. Individual visits may have lasted only weeks or months, yet generations continued returning to exactly the same favourable places. You kneel beside one ancient hearth. The stones have shifted slightly over time, but they still form an almost complete circle. Perhaps each returning family repaired the fireplace rather than building a new one. Perhaps children heard stories explaining who first chose this campsite long before anyone alive could remember. Places accumulate meaning, not because they remain occupied continuously, because people keep coming back. A light breeze carries the scent of flowering plants across the meadow. Bees drift quietly between blossoms. Nearby, an elderly woman begins sorting edible roots gathered during the morning. Two younger adults watch carefully, without formal lessons. Another generation learns which plants nourish and which should be avoided. Knowledge remains anchored to place. Today we often save important locations inside digital maps. Our prehistoric ancestors stored them inside shared memory. The meadow itself became impossible to forget because stories connected every hill, stream, and distinctive tree to practical experience. You continue walking toward a grove of ancient-looking trees growing beside a small lake. Their broad branches provide welcome shade as afternoon warmth settles across the landscape. Several families have gathered beneath them. Children weave simple bracelets from grasses. An older man carefully reshapes a damaged spear shaft. Others prepare fish beside flat stones warmed by the sun. Nothing appears hurried. Life follows familiar rhythms. Another easily overlooked clue comes from the distribution of exotic materials found at prehistoric sites. Marine shells appear far inland. Rare stone types travel hundreds of kilometers from their geological source. Decorative objects sometimes move across surprisingly large regions. These discoveries suggest that hunter-gatherer communities maintained wide social connections extending well beyond their immediate neighbors. Such relationships mattered enormously. During difficult years, trusted friends living in another valley might provide food, information, marriage partners, or temporary shelter. Social networks functioned as a form of resilience long before anyone invented written agreements. You sit beside the lake and watch gentle ripples spread outward after a fish breaks the surface. The peaceful scene hides remarkable complexity. Every family gathered here maintains relationships reaching beyond the visible horizon. Some relatives may live across distant mountains, others near the coast. Still others beside rivers visited only every few years. People travel, news travels, ideas travel, objects travel. The landscape is connected through invisible threads. Exactly how extensive these prehistoric exchange networks became remains an active area of research. Some regions display abundant evidence of long-distance movement. Elsewhere, connections appear much more local. Environmental barriers, population density, and seasonal conditions all influenced how widely communities interacted. The picture changes from one landscape to another. You notice a young woman wearing a necklace made from shells unlike those found on this inland lake. Perhaps she received them during a seasonal gathering. Perhaps they came from relatives living near the coast. Perhaps they were exchanged several times before reaching her hands. The journey matters as much as the object itself. A shell becomes proof that distant people exist. One child asks where it came from. An elder points west toward the sea. The necklace becomes geography made visible. Late in the afternoon, several unfamiliar travelers appear along the edge of the meadow. Nobody panics. People watch quietly while the newcomers approach. Greetings are exchanged. Food is shared. Soon both groups sit together around expanding fires. The visitors bring stories of changing weather beyond the mountains. They describe unusually large herds moving south. They mention a river crossing damaged by recent flooding. Information flows as naturally as conversation. These seasonal gatherings may have strengthened social bonds while allowing practical knowledge to spread across remarkable distances. They also reduced isolation. Small communities connected regularly with others became part of much larger human networks than archaeology alone might suggest. As evening approaches, music begins. A simple bone flute joins rhythmic clapping. Children dance near the firelight. Older people smile quietly. No monumental buildings surround this gathering. No written laws organize it. No marketplace fills the meadow. Yet this is society in one of its oldest forms. Cooperation, memory, exchange, celebration. You watch sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. Each spark rises alone. Together they create a beautiful pattern. Human communities may have worked in much the same way. Individual camps remained small. Together they formed flexible networks stretching across enormous landscapes. Long before farming transformed the world, people were already building something less visible but equally important: relationships. Night settles gently over the meadow. The travellers prepare sleeping places beside familiar strangers who may become lifelong friends. Tomorrow they will continue toward different valleys. Some will carry shells, others will carry stone. Most importantly, all of them will carry stories. Those stories will cross rivers, forests, mountains, and generations, quietly linking communities that may never appear together in the archaeological record. The missing chapter of human history grows a little clearer, not because the evidence becomes complete, but because you begin seeing the invisible connections that once joined scattered people into a remarkably resilient human world. Morning arrives almost unnoticed. The first hint of daylight appears as a pale silver glow beyond the eastern hills. Around you, The meadow remains wrapped in mist. Dew hangs from blades of grass like tiny glass beads, and the last embers of the night's fire release thin streams of smoke into the cool air. People stir quietly. Someone stretches after sleeping beneath a hide. A child rubs sleepy eyes before reaching for a warm stone left near the fire. An elder adds another branch to the fading coals, coaxing a gentle flame back to life without a word. Nothing about the scene feels extraordinary. Yet moments like this were repeated countless millions of times across prehistoric history, forming a rhythm that shaped human life long before calendars or clocks existed. You gather your belongings and begin following a narrow path leading away from the seasonal camp. The trail passes through open woodland where sunlight filters gently between scattered branches. Birds greet the new day with cheerful songs, while squirrels dart among tree trunks searching for seeds. The forest feels welcoming. It also asks for constant attention. Every fallen branch could conceal a snake. Every unfamiliar berry deserves caution. Every change in birdsong may hint that a predator has entered the area. Long before written instruction manuals existed, the landscape itself became humanity's greatest teacher. As you walk beside a shallow stream, you notice how every member of the group responds differently to the surroundings. Children pause to examine colourful insects crawling across damp stones. Teenagers search for straight saplings suitable for spear shafts. Experienced adults glance almost instinctively toward animal tracks pressed into soft mud. The oldest members of the group seem to notice everything at once. A broken branch, fresh claw marks on tree bark, the smell of damp leaves after last night's brief rain. Years of observation have sharpened their senses into something that almost resembles intuition. In reality, it is memory layered upon memory. Carefully studied footprints preserved in ancient sediments reveal something remarkable. They're not always solitary. Many sites contain overlapping tracks left by adults, adolescents, and children travelling together. These preserved pathways offer a rare glimpse of ordinary movement rather than dramatic survival events. You pause beside the stream where muddy banks preserve today's footprints. Small ones, large ones, some deep beneath heavy loads. Others light and playful as children skip from stone to stone for a brief moment. Your own footprints join theirs. Tomorrow they will disappear beneath fresh rain. 40,000 years ago, the same thing happened. Most journeys left no lasting mark. Only on rare occasions did mud harden quickly enough to preserve a passing moment for thousands of generations. The path begins climbing gently toward higher ground. From the ridge, the forest stretches in every direction. Open meadows interrupt clusters of trees. A winding river glitters beneath the morning sun. Beyond it, distant hills fade into a soft blue haze. Choosing where to travel was never random. Every route balanced opportunity with risk. A shorter path might cross predator territory. An easier valley might flood after heavy rain. Dense forest offered shelter, but limited visibility. Open grasslands allowed hunters to spot animals from far away while leaving themselves equally exposed. The decisions changed with every season. You continue walking until the group pauses beside an unusually shaped rock overlooking the valley. Without discussion, everyone rests here. Some drink water, others quietly eat dried meat gathered during previous hunts. The stop feels familiar. Perhaps hundreds of travellers have rested at this very place over many generations. Not because anyone built a monument, simply because it offers shade, fresh water nearby, and a broad view of the surrounding landscape. Places become important through repeated use. A detail uncovered at several prehistoric sites supports this quiet pattern. Certain locations contain evidence of repeated short visits spread across centuries rather than continuous occupation. The landscape itself became organized through remembered stopping points, reliable shelters, and trusted landmarks. You smile as one young boy climbs onto the large rock pretending to watch for mammoths in the distance. His grandmother laughs softly before pointing toward real deer grazing far below. Even play becomes practice. Children learn observation without realizing they are learning. The journey resumes as afternoon approaches. Clouds begin gathering over the western hills. The wind changes direction. Leaves turn their pale undersides toward the sky. Several adults exchange brief glances. No one speaks, the pace simply increases. Long familiarity with local weather has already provided enough warning. Rain arrives an hour later. Not a violent storm, just a steady curtain of cool water drifting across the forest. People immediately spread hides over baskets. Stone tools remain unaffected. Bundles of dry tinder receive careful protection. Fire can be replaced. Dry tinder often cannot. Small practical decisions like these accumulated into survival. You take shelter beneath a broad rock overhang. Rainwater trickles down moss-covered stone before disappearing into the earth below. The group settles comfortably. Someone begins reshaping a flint blade while waiting. Another carefully twists plant fibers into stronger cord. Children collect smooth pebbles from nearby puddles. Waiting never becomes wasted time. Many archaeologists have noted that prehistoric camps often contain unfinished tools alongside completed ones. This suggests that maintenance and repair formed a constant part of daily routines rather than occasional special tasks. Survival depended as much upon caring for existing equipment as creating new tools. Outside, rain continues tapping gently against leaves. The sound blends with distant birds and flowing water. It becomes almost hypnotic. You realize that patience may have been one of humanity's greatest adaptations. Animals follow instinct. Humans often wait. Waiting for storms to pass, waiting for migrating herds, waiting for berries to ripen, waiting for children to grow skilled enough to contribute. Entire societies learn to move according to rhythms they could never control. Eventually the clouds drift eastward. Sunlight returns, everything sparkles beneath tiny droplets. Spider webs suddenly become visible, decorated with hundreds of shining beads. Fresh animal tracks appear clearly in softened ground. Rain has erased yesterday's marks while creating perfect conditions for reading today's. The hunters pause frequently now. Each footprint tells part of a larger story. A doe passed here not long ago. A fox crossed the trail during the rain. Wild boar rooted beneath nearby bushes sometime before dawn. The forest has become a living journal written without words. Exactly when prehistoric people mastered such sophisticated tracking cannot be determined with certainty. Even so, communities living entirely from wild resources almost certainly depended upon observational skills far beyond those possessed by most people today. As evening approaches, the group reaches another familiar campsite nestled between large limestone outcrops. The location offers shelter from prevailing winds. Fresh water flows nearby. Firewood is abundant. Flat stones provide comfortable places for preparing food. No one debates whether to stop here. Experience has already made the decision. Soon another fire crackles warmly beneath the darkening sky. The day's collected mushrooms roast beside strips of fish caught from the morning stream. Children excitedly describe insects they discovered. Adults quietly compare the fresh tracks seen after the rain. The conversation itself becomes another form of mapping. Knowledge spreads from one mind to another before sleep arrives. You lean back against the cool limestone wall and watch smoke drift upward through the evening air. Nothing dramatic happened today. No great hunt, no dangerous predator, no astonishing discovery. Only a day's careful travel shaped by memory, observation, patience, and shared experience. Perhaps that is the lesson hidden within so much of human prehistory. History was not built solely through extraordinary moments. It was built through thousands upon thousands of ordinary days, each one adding another quiet layer to the knowledge that allowed future generations to continue walking safely beneath the same ancient sky. Sleep comes easily after the long day's walk. The gentle crackle of the fire blends with the steady chorus of crickets hidden among the grasses above the limestone shelter. The stars wheel silently across the sky, following paths older than memory itself. The warmth from the nearby embers reaches you just enough to soften the cool night air. When dawn finally arrives, a thin layer of mist fills the valley below. You step outside the shelter while the world is still quiet. The ground is cool beneath your feet. Moisture clings to every leaf, somewhere in the distance. A stag gives a low call that echoes between the hills before fading away. Morning in prehistory often began not with urgency, but with careful observation. Before anyone chose a direction, lit a fresh cooking fire, or gathered supplies, they looked, the sky, the wind, the clouds, the movements of birds, the condition of nearby plants, the behavior of animals. Each offered a small piece of information about the day ahead. Standing on the ridge, you notice birds lifting suddenly from a grove far below. Moments later, several deer emerge from the trees and move cautiously toward open grassland. Nothing appears alarming, yet every change fits into a larger pattern that experienced eyes quietly recognize. Nature is constantly speaking. The challenge is learning its language. One of the most revealing discoveries from archaeological research comes not from tools or bones, but from ancient pollen preserved beneath lakes and wetlands. Layer after layer of microscopic grains settled year after year, creating an environmental archive that allows scientists to reconstruct long, vanished landscapes with surprising precision. A valley filled with pine forests, a period when grasslands expanded, a slow return of mixed woodland. These silent records help explain why people repeatedly altered their movements across thousands of years. You continue downhill toward a broad river bordered by tall reeds. Morning sunlight reflects from the calm surface, while dragonflies skim just above the water. The river has changed since yesterday. Recent rain has raised the water level slightly. The current moves faster now. Crossing requires patience. Several adults search for a familiar ford where the riverbed becomes shallow enough to pass safely. Nobody rushes. One careless decision could destroy precious tools or sweep a child downstream. Eventually the crossing begins. Adults carry the youngest children. Bundles are held high above the water. Walking sticks probe the unseen riverbed before each careful step. The crossing succeeds because everyone moves together. Archaeological evidence often preserves the dramatic moments of hunting or tool-making. Yet cooperation probably shaped daily survival just as deeply. Many ordinary tasks became safer and more efficient when shared among several people, rather than attempted alone. Once across the river, the group pauses beneath a stand of hazel trees. Several women begin collecting ripe nuts. Children eagerly join them, laughing whenever particularly large clusters are discovered. The harvest seems almost effortless compared with pursuing fast-moving animals across open country. Plant foods rarely receive as much attention as mammoths or spears, yet they contributed enormously to prehistoric diets. Different seasons brought different opportunities. Fresh berries, edible roots, wild fruits, seeds, nuts rich in fat that could be stored for colder months. The landscape offered variety to those who understood its cycles. A fascinating pattern appears at many archaeological sites where charred plant remains survive inside ancient hearths. Although preservation is rare, these fragile traces remind us that prehistoric meals often contained a far broader range of foods than bones alone might suggest. You help gather fallen hazelnuts into woven baskets. The work is calm, almost meditative. Every handful represents energy stored for the future. Some will be eaten tonight. Others may remain untouched until winter. Planning ahead does not require agriculture. It begins whenever people intentionally save today's abundance for tomorrow's uncertainty. As the afternoon unfolds, you notice another quiet habit. Nothing useful is wasted. Broken antlers become raw material. Animal sinew is carefully preserved. Strong branches are set aside for future spear shafts. Smooth stones are carried because they may prove useful many days later. Even small fragments of flint are examined before being discarded. The mindset is striking. Resources are respected not because of abstract environmental ideals, but because obtaining replacements requires effort. Every object carries the memory of work invested in finding it. A tiny flint blade may represent an entire day's journey to a distant outcrop. Researchers studying prehistoric quarry sites have found evidence that high-quality stone was sometimes transported across remarkable distances. Such discoveries reveal careful planning rather than random wandering. Valuable raw materials were worth carrying despite their weight because reliable stone could not always be found nearby. You leave the hazel grove and climb toward another rocky overlook. From here, several familiar landmarks become visible. The river bends sharply to the south. A line of pale cliffs marks the western horizon. Beyond them lie valleys visited during earlier seasons, without maps or written directions. People remembered landscapes through repeated experience, stories, and shared travel. Every prominent hill acquired meaning. Every unusual rock became a landmark. Memory transformed geography into something personal. Late in the afternoon, the group encounters a fresh set of tracks pressed into soft ground. Not deer, not wild horses, human. Several adults kneel to examine them carefully. The footprints belong to another community moving in the opposite direction. The impressions remain crisp. They were made only a few hours ago. Nobody appears frightened. Instead, curiosity quietly replaces surprise. Will these travellers camp nearby tonight? Are they relatives, friends, complete strangers? No one can know yet. Such encounters probably varied enormously across prehistoric landscapes. Some may have led to shared meals and exchanged news. Others ended after little more than polite observation from a distance. Occasionally they may even have introduced new technologies or fresh ideas that gradually spread across neighbouring regions. The archaeological record preserves objects far more easily than conversations. Countless words that once shaped human history disappeared into the air forever. As evening approaches, Smoke becomes visible beyond a cluster of trees. Another camp. The two communities eventually meet beside a small clearing. Greetings are cautious but warm. Children study one another with shy curiosity before beginning to play together almost as though they had always been friends. Adults exchange gifts that seem modest by modern standards. A beautifully shaped flint blade, several dried fish, a necklace made from polished animal teeth. The objects matter. The trust matters even more. Across many prehistoric societies, relationships may have functioned as a form of insurance. A familiar face beyond the next valley could become invaluable during difficult seasons, failed hunts, or unexpected illness. Night falls gently over the shared campsite. 2 fires now burn instead of 1. Stories pass from one circle to another. Someone demonstrates a slightly different way of attaching a stone point to a wooden spear. Another describes an unfamiliar valley where herds have recently become more numerous. Knowledge spreads naturally through conversation. No one announces that history is changing. It simply does. You settle beside the fire and watch sparks disappear into the darkness overhead. Every meeting adds another thread to the vast web connecting prehistoric communities. Most of those threads have vanished without leaving direct evidence, yet their influence remains woven into the survival of our species. Long before books recorded ideas or roads linked distant settlements, people carried information in their memories, their voices, and their willingness to share what they had learned. Perhaps that quiet exchange of knowledge was one of humanity's greatest inventions, invisible to archaeology in many ways, yet powerful enough to shape the future of every generation that followed. The shared camp grows quiet, one conversation at a time. Children who spent the evening chasing one another across the clearing have long since fallen asleep beneath soft hides. The last few adults remain near the glowing embers, speaking in low voices while occasionally adding another branch to the fire. Above them, the stars appear almost impossibly bright, untouched by the lights that will one day fill cities across the world. You sit at the edge of the firelight, letting the warmth settle into your hands. Tomorrow, the two communities will almost certainly travel in different directions. Their footprints will separate. Their stories will continue along different rivers and valleys. Yet for one brief evening, their lives have crossed. That simple meeting may become part of a memory repeated for decades. As dawn approaches, the camp begins to stir once again. Smoke rises gently into the cool morning air. Someone prepares a simple meal. Another carefully rolls up bedding made from animal hides. Children gather the small treasures they collected the previous day. Smooth stones, unusual feathers, and shells carried far from the coast. Nothing is left behind without thought. Before the travellers separate, they stand together for a final moment. There is no ceremony, no formal farewell. Only quiet nods, warm expressions, and a shared understanding that paths may cross again when another season returns. Soon the forest absorbs both groups. Within an hour, there's little sign that anyone camped here at all. The fire has been carefully scattered. Loose branches cover the sleeping places. Birdsong gradually replaces the sounds of conversation. The clearing returns to silence. You continue along a familiar trail climbing toward higher ground. From the ridge, the landscape stretches farther than you can comfortably see. Rolling hills fade into distant mountains. Rivers shimmer beneath the morning sun. Patches of woodland alternate with open grasslands. Each valley contains possibilities. Each horizon hides another story. One thing becomes increasingly clear during this long journey through prehistory. The missing chapter of human history is not truly one missing chapter. It is thousands of missing chapters. Entire generations lived, laughed, worried, celebrated, argued, loved, taught, and grew old without leaving names behind. Their homes disappeared, their songs faded into silence, their voices dissolved into the wind, yet traces remain. A worn stone tool, a handful of charcoal, tiny fragments of pollen preserved beneath ancient lake beds, footprints pressed into soft mud after unexpected rain, pieces of shell carried hundreds of kilometers from the sea, a child's milk tooth resting quietly beneath cave sediment. Individually, each discovery seems small. Together, they begin forming an extraordinary picture. The picture is still incomplete. Perhaps it always will be. That incompleteness is not a failure of archaeology. It reflects the extraordinary passage of time itself. Imagine writing an entire library on leaves scattered through a forest. Thousands of years later, only a few pages remain. The surviving pages still tell an important story, but no reader would expect them to contain every sentence ever written. Human history resembles that library. The missing pages invite curiosity rather than frustration. Across different continents, new discoveries continue to reshape familiar ideas. A cave explored today may preserve ancient DNA, unlike anything previously identified. A dried lake shore may reveal forgotten footprints after centuries beneath sediment. A sinkhole might protect delicate wooden objects that rarely survive elsewhere. Every excavation has the potential to ask entirely new questions instead of simply answering old ones. You descend into another valley where wildflowers sway gently in the breeze. Butterflies drift from blossom to blossom. Bees hum steadily among flowering plants. Nothing in the peaceful scene suggests that beneath your feet lies layer upon layer of forgotten lives. A family may have rested here 30,000 years ago, another perhaps 15,000 years later. Each believed the present moment was ordinary. None imagined that distant descendants would someday search patiently through the ground, trying to understand how they lived. You pause beside a stream flowing over smooth stones. The water is so clear that every pebble appears magnified beneath the surface. Without thinking, you kneel and watch the current. The stream never stops moving. No single drop remains for long, yet the river continues. Humanity followed a similar course. Individuals came and went. Communities flourished and faded. Cultures changed. Languages emerged and disappeared. Still, the larger current continued flowing forward. Perhaps the greatest surprise uncovered through decades of research is not that ancient people were different from us. It is how familiar they often appear. Parents worried about children. Young people learned from experienced elders. Communities adapted after difficult seasons. Friends reunited after long journeys. People laughed together around evening fires. They admired beautiful objects. They mourned those who were gone. The tools changed. The emotions remained remarkably recognizable. You continue walking until afternoon sunlight bathes the valley in warm gold. The path gradually climbs toward a broad limestone outcrop overlooking forests, rivers, and distant plains. It feels like a fitting place to stop. You sit upon the weathered stone and allow your eyes to wander across the immense landscape. Somewhere beyond those hills, people are making new discoveries. Children are learning to shape stone. Hunters are following fresh tracks. Gatherers are filling woven baskets. Someone is telling a story that will be remembered for generations before disappearing forever. Most of those moments will never enter the archaeological record, yet they mattered. History is built far more from ordinary days than extraordinary ones. As evening approaches for the final time, the sky gradually shifts from blue to amber, then to deep violet. Long shadows stretch across the valley. Birds settle into the trees. The wind softens. Another fire is lit nearby. Its glow feels reassuring after so many days of travel. You realize that throughout this journey, the greatest mystery has never been whether prehistoric humans survived impossible challenges. They clearly did. The deeper mystery is how much of their world vanished without leaving visible traces, the stories never spoken aloud again. The skills passed through only one family before disappearing. The places now resting beneath forests, deserts, rivers, and oceans. The friendships formed during chance meetings. These songs sung only once beneath a sky filled with ancient stars. Perhaps those missing pieces are exactly what make this chapter so compelling. Every new discovery reminds us that the past is not fixed. It continues revealing itself little by little, asking us to remain patient, humble, and curious. As darkness gently settles across the land, you take one final look at the quiet world surrounding you. The fire crackles softly. The stars return overhead. The same moon that watched those ancient travelers now watches you. Across tens of thousands of years, one simple connection remains unbroken. Human beings have always searched for meaning in the landscapes around them, and somewhere beneath those landscapes, still waiting in silence, are countless forgotten stories that have yet to be found. The missing chapter of human history is not completely lost. It is still being written every time careful hands uncover another small piece of the ancient world, allowing forgotten lives to speak once more through stone, bone, ash, and memory. Sweet dreams.